Hey guys, today I have the pleasure to speak to David Heinemeier Hansson, also known as DHH. David is the creator of Ruby on Rails, the co founder of 37 Signals, and he is a best selling author. In this conversation, we talk about a bunch of stuff. We talk about Linux, the terminal renaissance, Rails, how personality affects what kind of programming language a developer likes. We talk about religion, philosophy, stoicism, attachment, addiction, weed legalization, changing your mind over time. We talk about tech and its relationship to political issues. We talk about really just a bunch of interesting stuff. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I think you will too. And so, without further ado, here is David Heinemeier Hansson. Okay, David, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure.
Okay, the reason I decided to reach out to you is because you've been spending this time on Twitter talking about your journey, going through like learning Linux and all this stuff. So I want to ask you: Is 2024 finally the year of the Linux desktop?
Well, I was trying to be sort of temperate about it. So when I wrote about my own Linux journal, and I have been writing about it, I've been calling it 2025. I'm
Ah,
saying like
yes.
2024 is when we're sort of ratcheting up and
Uh
getting
huh.
everything ready. And then 2025 is when the big push is going to happen. Now, what's so funny about that is partly because it's a joke. I think it's been running since what, 97 or
Yeah.
96. People have been saying like, this is the year of Linux on the desktop, and everyone has perhaps their own definition of that. And I think the definition that is Linux is going to dominate the desktop. It's going to wipe out Windows and it's going to put Apple out of business with their
Mm-hmm.
MacBooks. I mean, that was never going to happen, right? So when I call for Linux on the desktop, I'm more modest in my
Like
aspirations.
Linux for my desktop.
First of all, Linux for my desktop. Well, that we can call 2024 for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But then also just getting to a significant market share, at least within technically sophisticated users. Because I
Mm-hmm.
think part of the Linux on the desktop discourse that's been setting itself up for failure is that it's trying to define, first of all, the whole thing as one market. Like, oh, let's get on the desktop. That means all desktop computers. That means everyone who's sort of using a computer for anything. And that's, I think, a tall order. And you
Mm.
should set yourself more achievable goals first before you go like, oh, do you know what? I like climbing. Let's start with Mount Everest.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe start with a mountain that's slightly smaller. And I think, I mean, that's been certainly also my own experience, is that there's obviously a lot of very technically minded people, programmers and other folks who are very intimate with computers. Start there first.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, that is a huge market. Second of all, they're A, more likely to recognize what Linux brings to the table, and B, they're more capable perhaps to still deal with some of the snags that are on the platform. So when I say Linux on the desktop 2025, I'm actually mostly talking about like my own field, my own domain
Yeah, yeah,
programmers.
yeah.
That let's get to a significant number of people. Let's even just call it like if 10% of all programmers were on Linux, I think that's a nice, solid, yet achievable goal.
Mm.
I think the internet stat says that like 4% of all internet users are on Linux, but I think that also includes Chromebooks, maybe.
Right.
I don't know how the
Yeah, and
stats break
I
down.
feel weird counting Chromebooks. It kind of seems like it's cheating to include that
It
because
is.
yeah.
I think it is. I think you got to go like, you know what? I mean, what's interesting with it is I think it's actually pretty awesome. The Chromebook is based on Linux, and I think there is overlap and help and so forth. But that's not what I would say. Oh, you're a programmer, you should start using a Chromebook. I think
Yeah,
there probably are some people who do, maybe, but for most, they should go with a mainstream, which is even a weird word to use, but a mainstream Linux distribution like Ubuntu or whatever.
for sure. It's kind of interesting like Linux is in many ways it seems to come hand in hand with a more terminal based workflow. And
Yes.
I don't know if there's a good reason for that, but that's often what you see. And there are some diehards who are just fully in the terminal and that's just all they do. And obviously, you had an experience using like NeoVim and my own pride and joy Lazygit and LazyDocker. I want to know, like, why do you think we haven't just moved completely away from terminal applications? Like, why is this thing still lingering on and holding on for life? Like, what's special about it that keeps it in the zeitgeist?
It's a really good question. And I think if you had asked me like a year ago before I started my Linux journal, I would have said, I don't think we are.
Mm,
I think that most people, even developers, are actually not that terminally terminally exposed to
mm-hmm,
terminals. Um, they are in VS Code. They are in other things. They use a terminal, but I don't know if most of them necessarily have an affection for it.
mm,
And that to me really was part of the magic of switching to Linux. I've been using a Unix powered machine since what 2001 when I switched to Mac OS or
mm-hmm.
OS 10 as it was called back then, which is based on sort of Unix underpinnings, and terminal is a part of that, but obviously also very heavily grounded in the Mac and graphical user interfaces and so forth. Um, and yet, even though all my work is like I'm a programmer, I work with open source programming language. I use the terminal for a whole lot of things. I don't know if I had yet had the full exposure of what the terminal could be. And I think that's why I'm actually so excited
Mm.
about what's going on with Linux and tools like Lazygit that I didn't even know existed. And that was my marvel where I went, do you know what? I'm a programmer. I'm doing open source development. Like, I should know. How is it that I didn't know? How is
Yeah,
it that I didn't know that all these wonderful tools existed? Not just sort of replacement for something like a Git GUI with Lazygit, but also all the little tools like EZA and all these improvements to the terminal experience that are out there. And like, it's not even like they're hidden. It's not
mm,
like people are like, oh, you can't see my awesome terminal world. But there's almost like a subculture that exists a little bit separate from the mainstream programming environment. And sometimes they overlap.
yeah.
Um, but I was just marveling at the fact that, oh, I didn't know it was this good. I didn't know it was this appealing. I didn't know it was this enjoyable. I thought, to be perfectly honest, I thought that people, Linux people, terminal heavy people, like were a little strange, like a
Mm-hmm,
little odd, like odd in a good way, right? But like
mm-hmm.
odd in that that's not me kind of way. And that was really a mistake. And I kind of feel like I've cheated myself out of being more productive, having more fun as a programmer with all these tools available that I've really discovered this year in particular. And that's why I'm so passionate about going like, okay, if I didn't know, there's got to be a lot of other people who didn't know either. So
Mm,
we got to help them see what's here. And I think Linux in particular is really interesting because I think there's a bunch of people in technology who've been exposed to Linux their whole lives because they've been working with the internet and whatever, and Linux been a fixture since the 90s,
mm-hmm.
and they've anchored their perceptions of what Linux is to whatever, some Ubuntu CD from 2008,
Yeah,
or seeing some person with a split keyboard that just was like too far away, too weird from what they were doing. Maybe they were running like a tiling virtual manager or something else that just looked very, very foreign from what they were used
yeah.
to.
Like a
And they
keyboard with
decided
no arrow keys, like that
exactly
kind of thing. Yeah.
that Linux today is a lot better than it was even 5, 6 years ago. And I find this not just Linux, it's true about a lot of things. Someone who's been in technology for a while will develop a certain mental model of what certain technologies are capable of. And those mental models will update quite slowly
Mm-hmm.
and they will quickly drift and get out of date. And I've seen that in other forms of web development, what we think browsers are capable of, whether we need transpilers or bundlers and all these other things. Sometimes technology moves ahead of your mental model,
Mm,
and if you don't make a concerted effort to catch up, you'll just be left missing out
mm-hmm.
on progress that was available to you. And I think that's really been part of what's true in the Linux world. And I also think, unfortunately, part of the joke of Linux on the desktop, having been around for 30 years, is that it a little bit angers that, right? It was a joke 10 years ago, it was a joke 20 years ago, it was a joke 30 years ago. Actually, you'd be a rational observer, you'd go like it's also going to be a joke today and a joke tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, that's just how most things are. If it's been that way for 30 years, like it's going to be difficult to pick up when it's no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
But first of all, I think it is no longer true. Um, and second of all, I think the fact that it's no longer true is partly connected to the resurgence of this fascination with with terminal tools,
Mm-hmm.
which I think Lazygit is one example of it. NeoVim is another example of it. Zellige and some of these other tools, as we talked about, are examples of these are modern tools. These are not tools that necessarily have a 30-year history. I mean, NeoVim has basically back to 78 or whatever you can trace with, but the current implementation that's solidly modern, being worked on by someone else than just aging graybeards.
Mm.
And that is a really fascinating phenomenon that reminds me about sort of other shifts where we go back to a earlier way of living and finding that more appealing. Like I'm into both watches and cars, and
Uh-huh.
with watches, mechanical watches, they went through this quartz crisis in the late 70s, early 80s, where everyone, when there's a new technology out, it's so much better at keeping time at a low cost. You can make a quartz watch for almost no money at all. It'll keep time better than the finest switch watchmaking. So you went through this period of, I don't know, 5, 6 years. I forget how long the dark ages of the Swiss industry was with the quartz crisis. And then you came out on the other side, and suddenly there were a bunch of people go like, yeah, but do you know what? The point of a watch is not just telling time.
Mm.
The point of a watch is also to admire craftsmanship and the art and the all the stuff in it, right? So one example. The other example I like is manual transmissions.
Mm-hmm.
So manual transmissions have sort of been outdated for quite a while. I know in Europe, I mean, we clung on to them for a lot longer than they did in the
Mm-hmm.
US. I learned how to drive a car with a manual, but then automatic boxes got so good, and most importantly, especially in Europe, got so cheap that it no longer necessarily made sense to have a manual. And you went through the same phase also at the high end of the car market with all the supercars and whatnot. Everyone wanted the paddles, they wanted like new technology. It lasted for a quartz crisis amount of time until people realized, yeah, but you know what? Driving a car isn't just about being efficient, it's also
Mm.
about being involved.
Mm.
It's also about the joy of actually shifting a gear. Now, is that a mass market mainstream thing? People just want to go to the shop? No, that's not what a lot of them think about. But the enthusiasts do. And I see the same thing with Linux and the terminal in particular, and those two things, like how they're related. People were rediscovering the terminal. Actually, there's something really cool about manipulating a computer predominantly through a keyboard. And
Mm.
the terminal is just like that's what the terminal is.
Mm-hmm.
Notwithstanding I'm always amazed when I move my mouse around in NeoVim and I can actually drag things. I'm like, it's somehow
Yeah.
there's a schism there that doesn't seem to make sense. I'm happy about it that it's possible, but I think the approach and the fascination with the terminal is returning to actually interfacing with the computer through the keyboard is really, it's not just neat, it's not just more direct in some sense, it's fun,
Mm.
it's fast, it's productive. There's all these different facets of it that all overlap. And I think if I was going to be predicting person, which what I like to do about predicting the future is to basically just extrapolate from wherever I am right now. That's not widespread. The terminal is one of those things. I think we're going to see more terminal usage, more TUIs going forward than we are. That there's a resurgence with the terminal, and as the terminal resurges, I think the move to Linux is going to be very natural. I think
Yeah.
what grounded a lot of people in the Mac was GUIs. Like that's what the Mac is exceptional at. That's
Mm-hmm.
where it had an advantage over Linux. In the terminal, there's no advantage. I mean, if anything, maybe there's a slight disadvantage. Once you get used to a terminal, you like to have like a built-in package manager and whatever, all the other things that come with it,
Mm.
which Mac does a passable job of. I used Homebrew for many years, a wonderful project, but I like the Ubuntu setup better, and I like some of this tooling better, and I like a whole operating system that's built around those things. And then when you realize that, especially if you work with the web, you go like, actually, there's something pretty neat about running the same operating system as I run my services on the computer. My dependencies are described the same way, and I just get more familiar with the technology that runs the thing I put into production. I
Yeah.
think that's a good thing too.
I think that most of the times that I've heard that a colleague is using Linux, it's just because Docker for Mac was so slow, having to run this virtual machine and the fans would be blasting on your MacBook Pro.
Right.
It was like a
Yes.
big thing in my previous company. And
Yes.
yeah, it makes a
It's
huge
still a
difference to
thing.
just be directly in Linux.
It's still a thing. I mean, what's interesting is that Docker for Mac has improved leaps and bounds. I mean, it
It
was
has
truly terrible. The whatever the file system crosswalk thing was
OSFX,
just
whatever it's called. Yeah.
exactly so slow and was so bad. It's not that bad, but it's still not great. Like for
Mm.
example, at our company, 37 Signals, we run the test suite against the Docker database now. And when I run on Linux, I can't tell the difference whether I run those tests against a native MySQL or Postgres instance, or I run them in Docker.
Mm.
On the Mac, it's about a 30% haircut. Like the tests take 30% longer to run. So there definitely is still a penalty there. What's funny about that too is, I mean, I love Docker, and one of the reasons I love Docker is exactly because it works both on the Mac and it even works on Windows and it works on Linux, and we even use it for deployment now. We built this tool called Kamal
Uh huh.
that uses just basically straight Docker as a much simpler version of getting containerized deployments without going the whole Kubernetes route. So we're just using Docker. Love Docker. I think it's one of those great leaps forward, containerization and productizing that in a way that makes it so approachable.
Hmm.
Absolutely huge fan of it. Can't necessarily say about that about the GUI on the Mac in particular. That's
As
my
you can
main choice,
imagine,
right?
I agree. Yeah.
Exactly. Versus Lazy Docker has that same appeal to it. Like this feels like the kind of technology that should be a TUI, where it's not a novelty, it's actually just legitimately better. What I
Mm.
usually want to do when I look at a container, I want to go in and look at its logs. I want to have a quick hotkey to jump into a terminal inside of that container. Docker for Mac does makes that kind of cumbersome,
Mm.
and Lazy Docker is just such a great example of like boom boom boom, three hotkeys and you're doing your thing. Even more so, I'd say, even though I use it a lot less, but even more so than Lazygit, because Git already had sort of the foundation that a lot of people used it directly through the terminal. I certainly did, even
Mm.
if I was also using the GitHub for desktop tool for some merge comparisons.
Hmm.
I would use the terminal for it a lot too. So you were already in the realm. Lazy Docker makes it or Lazygit makes it so much nicer, and especially to be able to the main thing I used GitHub um, for desktop for was when I wanted to make a partial commit. I never internalized whatever I had to do in the terminal to commit like 2 lines out of a diff
There was
on a single
nothing to
file.
internalize. It was borderline impossible. Like,
Exact. Yes.
yeah.
And
I
that
still
too.
don't think there's a solution to that, just directly using the CLI that doesn't require like updating the patch headers
Totally. So
manually.
I just before GitHub for Docker, I didn't do that. I would actually literally revert some changes if I had forgotten to make a commit, make the commit, and then paste the changes back in. Versus with LazyGit, you get as good, in fact, better because it's easier to navigate with the hotkeys in the terminal to add which lines do I want in and which lines do I not want in. Um, but that was that difference. And then I think again, the more you get sucked into the terminal, because you discover all these great tools, the more of your workflow now lives in the terminal. Like the vast majority, the only thing that's basically left that doesn't live in the terminal for me is the browser.
Mm.
And um, all of this stuff reduces your dependency on a specific platform. One of the problems I really had, or I thought I had with the Mac, was there's these exclusive tools I can only use on the Mac. And some of them are true. Like I like Apple Photos. I think the Apple Photos app is actually a really good app, and it's one of
Hmm.
the best way of synchronizing photos across mobile devices and with family members and so on. Really nice app. I had to sort of compromise when I moved to Linux to do something else. I ended up with Google Photos. Not super thrilled with that. I know there are other solutions. I've looked at a bunch of them,
Hmm.
but it wasn't sort of slam dunky, right? And then I thought the same thing was true for my development workflow. I thought, for example, the TextMate, which is an editor I've been using for damn near 20 years and I still love dearly, which is very much a Mac application.
Mm.
I mean, it wasn't available to Linux. How could I do without? And then over 2 attempts, the first one failed, the second one stuck. I discovered NeoVim and rediscovered. I'd used Vim like 20 years ago and still had some of those hotkeys in my head. I rediscovered how neat it was. Then I discovered Lazy Vim, which is basically taking all this hardship of the configurations, which I think, is, by the way, is a important point we should touch on. But took all the hardship of configuring NeoVim, which can be anything, which also means it could be everything, and like
Hmm.
it's just 1,000 blocks dumped on the floor that you have to spend like 50 hours figuring out how to together into some workable editor.
Hmm.
Lazy Vim basically gets like, yeah, do you know what? I put all the pieces together for you. Here's a great editor built on NeoVim, and that was my first exposure actually to Lazygit. I didn't even know it was Lazygit. I just did space, and it was
Right.
Vim having pre-configured it. Um, that kind of led me that way. I forget whether it like then tells you to install it, and that's how I got the name. That oh, you need Lazygit
Oh, yeah. Okay.
this or something. And I got down this trap, and then I realized, oh, okay, my whole development workflow, managing Git, uh, my text editor, all my terminal tooling, Zealage, like I was slumming it with tabs in the fucking default terminal on the Mac for literally years and years, right?
Yeah.
You start using a Zealage layout where you have multiple panes and all this stuff, and you go like, man, I was really on poverty row here with the
Yeah.
setup. It's so good. And then it only really took, I'd say it took probably 2 to 3 weeks before I went like, oh shit, I'm better off. Like first, like sort of, to be fair, I quit a little bit in spite. Like Apple had just finally pushed me over the edge. It was with this whole debacle over whether they were going to kill PWAs in Europe,
Hmm.
to spite some legislation, whatever. It was just the final straw. I had a tested relationship with Apple for a long time. But just to be fair, I went to Linux at first because I don't want to use a Mac anymore. I didn't go to Linux because, like, yes, I want to see what Linux got. Right? It was first a negative choice before it was a positive choice.
Yeah.
But after about those 3 weeks, collecting all of that stuff and realizing, do you know what? My development environment is actually a lot better than it was. And I've spent literally 2 decades building up the old muscle memory and using all the tools. And here I spent 3 weeks. They were difficult 3 weeks, I will say. When you first go from a GUI text editor in particular, even to lazy Git, I'll say, from GitHub to desktop, it's not on day one, it's not on day two, it's not on day three that you go like, oh yes, I love it.
Mm.
It's on day like probably four.
Hmm.
And the problem with day four is a lot of people don't make it through day one, two, or three. But I did because I was so motivated to really get out. And then I thought by week three, after things have been terminalized, I could lean back and go like, I'm really happy this happened. Like, actually, thank you, Apple, for whatever fuckery you were up
Thank you for
to.
fucking me around. Yeah.
Exactly. Because if you hadn't, inertia would just have done its thing. I would have
Mm.
stayed in my groove. I wouldn't have discovered all this wonderful stuff. And now I'm really happy that it happened. And now I've been running Linux for months now. I went kind of crazy when I first felt like I can't use a Mac anymore. I went like, okay, then I have to find the perfect alternative. And that's where I mean, I kind of, it is work, but in another way, it's also not. And I stopped the normal work I did for a fair time
Hmm.
to learn everything there is. Like go full deep dive, like hours and hours of YouTube videos, hours and hours of Linux deep dives on styling and so on. And what that ended up to was like basically compressing like literally a total of hundreds of hours into a project. That's what I like to do. I like to learn something, and then I like to try to see if I can compress the complexity that it took me to understand all of that, and then make it easier for someone else. And that's what became the AmaCube project,
Hmm.
which ships not only with NeoVim, it ships with Lazygit and LazyDogger and all the things such that I could go like, you know what? I just spent hundreds of hours, some of it needlessly so, but I enjoyed it. Um, Not everyone's going to do that. There's going
Mm.
to be a ton of Mac folks who just go like, you know what? I'm going to give this 2 hours. I need to see something in the first 2 hours that makes me hungry for more. And I thought, you know what? If you set up a stock Ubuntu and the first thing you see is that fucking purple terminal, you're gonna go like, I don't know.
Yeah,
And
it is.
again,
It is really depressing how in a lot of the stock, the stock standard distributions, the default terminal doesn't look that good, and it's like I thought Linux was all about the terminal. Why is the standard thing
yes,
here so below par, especially if you're coming from the Mac, which you use like iTerm.
yes, and I think that that was one of the things where I had that experience when I first went to Linux. Like, I spent a couple of days going like, I don't know if I can do this.
Mm.
Maybe I'm gonna have to eat my hat and go back to the Mac because I can't live like this. And then I forget how I stumbled upon it, but I think I stumbled upon the Reddit Unix porn, which is this super ricer, whatever. Everything is is a tiling VM setup, this, that, and the other thing. But what it did do to me was, oh shit, Linux can look like this? What? I
Mm.
vaguely remember having seen some images, but then I went into that Reddit and spent quite a while going like, oh, that's really cool. That's really cool. That looks better than the Mac. That looks better than the Mac. And I went like, but why does my thing just look like this purple terminal that like doesn't have good padding, doesn't I don't like it, right?
Yeah.
And then I went, okay, do you know what? This is possible. So a lot of people have figured out how to write Linux. It's still too hard and whatever. But like if a lot of people can find this, could we not make this more accessible? And that was where it kind of is two parts. And I think this is one of the reasons why Linux, for some people, have a hard adoption process, because you have the Linux people who are literally like, I don't give a shit how anything looks. Aesthetics are not essential.
Mm.
In fact, they're a distraction. I want something as austere and as basic. I'm just about functionality. And I
Mm.
say, like, that's the classic Linux image I had in my head.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what Linus, what his personal desktop looks like, but I kind of doubt it looks like Unix porn. Like, I
Same.
just have the image that maybe he
He's a
runs
very
the.
pragmatic person, and I
Yes.
think he's not very aesthetically driven.
And I think, I mean, we have all of the Linux ecosystem to thank for people like that, right? Like, I'm
Mm.
ever so grateful that there are a bunch of people who just went like, I don't care how it looks, I'm just going to make it work, and I'm going to make it free, and I'm going to make all the things we love about Linux. But what I realized through Unix Point is like, do you know what? Those people can still exist and still do their purple terminal default thing and not care about how things look. And we can also have the other stuff. And if we take both things and we make it work together, and we make it approachable and easy to set up and not hard to get like a good looking Linux that's heavily influenced by the Unix porn stuff, combined with all the stuff that Linux already does excellently, like the package management and so forth, combined with a curated set of defaults that are tailored to, for example, programmers, such that they don't have to figure out how to install all these things and learn all the stuff that goes into learning it. I think we could win over a lot of people. I thought, and I mean, I know I'm not exactly novel here. How many Linux distributions are there? About 5 million.
Yeah.
But I did think, actually, to some extent, even seeing all that, there's a packaging problem here. There's a packaging problem where all the bits are there. Again, that joke is also literally decades old, but all the bits are there. We just got to put them together better. And that's what got me sort of super excited about the YamaCube project, doing that, at least setting it up as I would want it. It was very self serving too. I was going through new hardware at a ferocious rate, trying to find the perfect laptop and the perfect desktop. So I literally ordered, I think I've gone through 6 or 7 different laptops.
Right.
And I've gone through at least 4 different desktops, just trying to find the perfect combination for me, right? Um, and setting everything up every time was a pain in the ass. And now half the audience is going to scream, "This is what Nix is for!" And then I look at Nix and I go like, yeah, Nix is one of those essentialists. I don't care about how things work. I don't care about how deep the complexity is. Like, it solves some problem. Again, that's not me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that. I don't want to learn a whole programming language just to set up the configuration.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to build on something that's mostly stock. I actually think, except for aesthetics, Ubuntu is a very fine operating system. And in fact, I don't even want to slag on it too much. You don't have to do that much to default Ubuntu to spruce it up a bit. But
Mm.
you can do a bunch. And that's what I tried to do in Namco. I tried to set up, like, what would my ideal setup could be? Can I make it a one command replication? Such that when I get a new laptop in, because I want to try another one, I'm going to be up and running in like 15, 20 minutes rather than 2 hours.
Mm.
Um, and I think I certainly arrived there for me myself, and that just gave me the confidence to think, you know what? I think we could get a lot of people interested in this. I think a lot of people could see that you don't actually have to put down the Mac. You don't even have to be negative on the Mac choice. You can still go like, hey, Apple does a fine job making hardware. They really do. They make some great hardware. But there's also other good hardware out there, and some of it makes different trade-offs. Like, I remember when I first set up my Framework 13 laptop, and I went like, oh shit, a matte screen? I haven't seen one of those since like 2008 or whenever
Yeah.
the last MacBook was able to have that. And I was like, this is really nice. I had totally forgotten that existed, because it didn't exist or doesn't exist anymore in the Mac laptop world.
You can sit
And then,
outside and be in the sun and not have to see your reflection so easily.
right, right. Um, And then I went like, ooh, I really like this keyboard. Also, this keyboard, like the framework laptop keyboard, is 1.5 millimeters of travel instead of, I think the Mac one is half a millimeter of travel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like this feels so much nicer to type on. Again, it was actually a little almost nostalgic. This it felt very much like the original PowerBook keyboards. I think they probably also had 1.5 millimeters of travel.
Mm-hmm.
And I just went like, okay, the framework is not a unibody design, so not everything just feels like it's carved out of one piece of aluminum. But it does mean I can change my RAM, which I instantly did and upgraded to like 96 gigabytes just because I could, and it
Mm-hmm.
cost like $120 or something. Like if you can even imagine what Apple would charge for 96 gigabytes, it's probably in the thousands of dollars. Anyway, did that? Oh, you can change the SSD. You can change the freaking CPU. You can
Mm-hmm.
change the battery in like whatever 90 seconds. And most recently, I've changed the screen. I mean, that's something I didn't even never contemplated that that would be a possibility. You can change the screen to a better screen in your freaking laptop.
Mm.
Um, so I realized that having been in the Mac world for so long had kind of just narrowed the sense of possibilities. That there are different trade-offs that you can go like, yeah, the Mac is a good machine. The M chips, I mean, pretty amazing, right? Like they've really started a new renaissance for laptops and brought the competition to a new level and done wonders for battery. But you know what? As much as I love a long battery, who doesn't love a long battery, right? I actually care more about a matte screen and a good keyboard,
Mm.
which is a thing I didn't even think I was in the market for. I didn't even realize that that was a thing you could select. And I think this whole Linux journey has just made me realize, oh man, there's actually a very vibrant computer industry. I mean, this is a total joke about Mac people, right? Like that they don't know what else is out there. They know what the options are and whatever. But it was also kind of true. And yet being able to arrive at that place, even though it started from a negative place, and then go like, you know what? I I don't want to be here because I don't want to be somewhere else. I want
Yep.
to be here because I want to be here. And the journey started because I didn't want to be somewhere else, but it's thankfully fine, or not even finally, after a few weeks, ended up, oh, I want to be here because I want to be here. I really like this Framework 13 laptop. It's been a while since I've really been affectionate about a laptop. I think the last
Mm-hmm.
one was probably the MacBook Air 11 inch. I mean, for whatever reason, I just loved that machine. It was totally underpowered, had all sorts of trade offs, but just a great form factor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I realized, oh, I can fall in love with laptop hardware again, and then falling in love with an operating system. I actually thought if you were to had asked me a year ago, I would have thought like, you know what, I'm Mac until I retire. Um, so it's just been an exciting, super exciting journey to discover all these things, to realize just the body of work that's available and to align my own body of work more closely with that. I think that's also part of it. I've literally spent my entire career making open source software.
Mm.
Um, Yet being quite removed from one of the key pieces of open source software that's out there, that's Linux, and all the stuff that comes downstream from that. Notwithstanding, again, that a lot of these terminal tools, including Lazygit and other things, do work just fine on a Mac. Um, but I think you're more removed from it than you are in the Linux world.
Mm. There's so many things there that you touched on. I'd love to dig into. So, um, let's talk about open source. So you mentioned configuration. I get the sense that in open source tools, configuration is a bit more unwieldy than what you'll have in proprietary software. And
Yes.
even with Lazygit, I think it's just because some guy can just raise a pull request and say, "Hey, here's a config thing added for me," and you're like, "Well, I guess that makes sense. I can't think of a good reason not to have it." And I do look at the Lazygit config now, and I'm just like, "Oh man, like it's pretty big," and uh, maybe it's just maybe I need to be more of a Nazi when I come to reviewing those pull requests or something like that. But you did mention config before, and I was wondering, is that what you were thinking about? Like, what is it that has struck you about like the complexity of configuration on a Linux machine?
Yes, that is a huge part, and I think it is really tied to the archetype of the original Linux user, who is all about maximum configuration. I want my bespoke thing just for me, even if it takes me 100 hours to set that up. Then I will have this just for me. I don't share that vision at all. In
Mm,
fact, I find that vision, and I mean that in the best possible way, off-putting,
mm-hmm.
because I find it very inefficient on a planetary scale.
Right. You can't
And
scale it.
exactly. I mean that in the sense of, so I've been working on Ruby on Rails for over 20 years now. And one of the driving principles of Ruby on Rails is convention over configuration. That there's just a huge body of potential configuration knobs that if we require everyone to understand all of them and tweak them just right, that's just a massive sinkhole of productive capacity that could have gone into better things. And also, when you look at the array of knobs available, that in itself is a signal to a large group of people who say, this is not for me. I don't want to understand 1,200 knobs and how I need to tweak them just right. I want to have one knob and one
Mm,
selector. I want to get on board with this train before I become an expert in Dwarf Fortress.
mm-hmm.
So that is what I would categorize as a product sensibility. I don't think there's not an excess of product sensibilities in the Linux world, in my opinion. There's a lot of other things, and a lot of things are perhaps good because that product sensibility is not there. But I think it is limiting to some extent, and I wanted to counter that in part because that's how I driven my open source development. Ruby on Rails is famously convention over configuration. How can we
Mm,
just all decide that we will spend a long time trying to find, if not the best, then a very good default, and then just go like most people shouldn't mess with that. Maybe there's not even a knob.
mm.
In fact, it's funny. We're working on a number of new open source tools right now, and no knobs. That's literally a design directive. Like we've been going through we're building some proxy stuff for making it easier to set up Rails applications and so on. And like the natural instinct for most programmers, and I have to push back against this, is like, oh, this should probably just be a configuration. And then I go like, okay, if it should, um, when would you pick one value over the other? And I'd say, no, well, I mean, it should be 8. 8 is the right value because like that just is nice. But like in case someone wanted to change it, like they could make it 3. And I go
Mm-hmm.
like, no, we're not going to put a knob in until we can reasonably put ourselves in the mind of someone who wants to turn it for a really good reason. And that really good reason has to be sort of an essential thing that isn't just because this was the first knob I discovered and I was actually trying to do the third thing, but this is a way to get around it. Um, Reducing the total number of knobs has value in and of itself. It makes a piece of software not just appear simpler, but be simpler. Every single knob that can be turned is part of the power law of total configuration points. If you have 5 knobs and they can all be turned 10 ways, you're 10 to the fifth, right? In all the permutations. The more
Mm-hmm.
permutations, the more complexity, both literally, in terms there's more places for bugs to come in, but also mentally and conceptually. And actually, it's the mental and conceptual part I have the most interest in protecting. That like we are fragile, squishy humans who can only hold so much in working memory. The more knobs, the more this piece of software takes up in here, and the less room there is for everything else. I mean, that's the other joke about Neo Vim and Vim in general, right? Like that you shove in all the key bindings, and there's actually literally no room for social skills. Shove
Yeah, yeah.
everything. And I mean that's a joke, but it's also maybe a little bit true.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some of the complexity that we tolerate in one piece of software is preventing us or prohibiting us from zooming out further. I'm a big proponent of conceptual compression because if we compress concept into smaller blocks that are easier to understand and remember, there's room for more. And if you can have room for more concepts, literally, in your head, you can have room for a bigger and bigger picture.
Mm,
And if your big picture can be so big as to encompass like your entire application and your entire work method, you can make more connections across the different pieces. And that's where a lot of the core innovation comes from. And that's where you see simplifications because, oh, I know the box over here is related to this box. This is why Rails famously tries to not just tries, but is a full stack framework. It's trying to solve a large problem in a cohesive way. Let's solve the web application. Now, that's a very ambitious, very large problem. But Rails goes like, okay, fine. Let's solve HTML generation. Let's solve database access. Let's solve email out. Let's solve email in. Let's
mm,
solve talking on WebSockets. Let's the only way Rails can remain understandable, not just for me, but for anyone else who wishes to adopt it, is if we try our damnedest to compress every one of those concepts into smaller and smaller blocks until they fit. And a large part of that compression is which knobs can we get rid of? Um, so that's what helps drive my aversion to knobs. And it's not like know that it shouldn't have any configuration points, right? Like, especially if you work on infrastructure tools, like that's basically the whole thing it is, right? Like you get Rails and then you make your own app and you do it by using Rails and changing things and whatnot. But there's so much that I find to be incidental complexity, right? It's there because it ended up there, not because it has to be there. And if you think hard about the problem, and if you keep it as a top value, that compression is desirable, you'll end up realizing, oh shit, we could get rid of that one. We
Mm.
could get rid of that one. We could get rid of that one. So on the one hand, you're shrinking the space of the solution, the conceptual space, while enlarging what it can do. That opposite direction is really intoxicating. I mean,
Mm.
that's basically what I love doing.
Perfect. So I do want to talk about Rails. Um, I want to know, like, what's your perspective on why Node doesn't have a viable Rails competitor? Like, they've had so much time to get their shit together. You've got everyone has to learn JavaScript to be able to do front end stuff, unless of course they're like, using Hotwire and they're not using Stimulus. But what's going on there? Like, do you think that there's some advantage that Rails has in terms of just like what the goal is? Like maybe there's a difference in goals, or maybe it's just a time difference. Like, what explains that?
I think it is a question of values, and
Mm.
those values, whether those values are able to be kept in check and integral to the ecosystem. Ruby already, when I showed up, had very distinct and clear values. Ruby's primary objective is for happy programmers.
Mm.
That's a very strange, odd, and at the time novel objective to have near, to, if not at the top of your list of priorities of how you design a programming language. You could have all sorts of other things. You could have runtime efficiency. You could have size of executable. You could have memory performance. All sorts of things that people used to have up there, right? Java had like let's prevent anyone from doing anything dangerous. All these things. Ruby had happy programmers at the top of the list. That's first of all weird, and by being weird, it is bound to be um, not mainstream,
Hmm.
which meant that the people who chose Ruby, certainly in the early days, and I'd actually argue still to this day, are choosing Ruby because they really want to. They're really attracted to that worldview that programmers are really important and you should write code first for programmers. And we're willing to sacrifice runtime performance for lyrical code, for poetic code. Again,
Hmm.
very foreign to, I think, a lot of those Linux folks, the long beards, like they would go like, what did you just say? Right? I think go
Hmm.
like, that just sounds nuts. But that tribe, if you will, those tribal values were both intact. Matt's, the creator of Ruby, was able to keep them intact because he had control over the language and no one was forcing him to grow market share or whatever. And Rails was able to show up at the right time inside that community and fuse with those values to a point that, again, anyone choosing to pick up Rails, um, they were making an active choice. That's not true with JavaScript. As you just said, everyone has to use JavaScript. So JavaScript becomes this melting pot where folks with very, very different ideas of what
Mm.
constitutes good programs show up and actually both A, have to collaborate to some extent, but B, mostly don't.
Mm.
That you get all of this fragmentation because you're forcing essentially the entire world to show up in one language community, and they're never going to agree on anything, nor should they. This is the key point. In an earlier iteration of myself, I thought very imperialistic about programming language, that you could sort of just conquer mindshare.
Mm.
Because if you just taught them the gospel of whatever you were really excited about, they were going to convert. And
Mm.
there's some of that. I mean, people do convert programming languages when they find it appealing, but there are also a bunch of nonsense in that, in the sense that um, different people are just wired differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably, if we could find to be true, maybe even true on a physical level, like the literal wires of neurons and
Yeah.
whatever are different. But it's certainly true at an intellectual level. Some people are like literally incredulous to the idea that you can write successful um, software that doesn't have static typing.
Yeah.
They like,
I
I
know
don't
I
need
know many such people, yeah.
exactly, where they literally, like, their mind is not capable of comprehending someone making large successful systems in something like Ruby. Like, forever their mind of it will be like, that's a toy language or whatever. What about all these bugs? And what's so fascinating about that worldview is that it exists in direct conflict with reality, direct conflict with, like, literally decades of proof, literally hundreds of billions of dollars in enterprise value. All these things can exist, and they can still, like, no, 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 but you don't understand. You have to have types.
Mm,
And that's what JavaScript is laboring under. It's laboring under the fact that those people who simply cannot even conceive of the fact that you can write successful software, first of all, they have to use JavaScript, which they then refuse, and then they start using TypeScript, right? I mean, I don't know if I've ever seen another programming environment where there's such a disdain for sort of the underlying system from certain dialects. Like, there are a bunch of TypeScript users who are really not fans of JavaScript.
mm,
That to me is fascinating.
yeah,
That,
and
like,
vice versa as well, yeah.
right, right. Um, I don't I don't know if that's it. Maybe is that true in Lisp dialects? I don't know enough about that, or small talk dialects, or some other. Maybe it is, but either way, that's not the case. Obviously, in Ruby, right? Like, there is Sorbet, for example, a project that's trying to add types, but it's there's not the big conflicts that you get in JavaScript because everyone is forced to use the same thing in JavaScript. So you could never have a Rails, because you could never have, like, a critical mass of mindshare capture, because
Mm,
no single concept or approach to software development can ever get that, because the people who are using the language are too different. You're bound to have all these tribal sections. And then when you have all these tribal sections, you're going to have this constant churn, and jockeying for position, and problems of collaboration and interaction and so on. It's actually, to my opinion, kind of a marvel
yeah.
that it's gone as well as it has, if you will. But to me, it also does explain why we will never see Rails in JavaScript.
I think I think about the person how personality relates to programming language choices all the time. Because in my mind, I'm always thinking about like the big five personality model, where
Yes,
it's like
yes,
openness to experience and
yes,
disagreeableness and all that.
yes,
And I think about how I made Lazygit in Go just because, I mean, there was no good reason. I just like, oh, it's a new language. I'll do it in Go. And then I found out when I look at like the subreddit for Go stuff, and on Hackers, like, I have nothing in common with any of these people. Like, all the values of this community is just, there's just no
yeah,
overlap.
yeah,
And it is funny because I think about Go developers, and they're very pragmatic. They're very,
yes,
I would say, low in openness, and not in a pejorative
yes,
sense, but they're just
yes,
very, they're about getting the work done and shipping code and all that stuff. And um, I find that it's just interesting that like you were saying with Linux, in the early days of something, there's a selection bias effect because people will go to something because they want to be doing that thing as opposed to it being forced upon them, and that's how you can get
yes.
these communities which are very homogenous. And I just find it fascinating. I find it really amazing because I was just like you. I used to think like, surely there is a one true way, and maybe it's Haskell. It's like, I don't know, maybe it is, but maybe we'll find out. But now I'm just thinking, no, I think it actually is just a reflection of the diversity of personalities and perspectives of different people.
I 100% agree. And I think it is a great way to tie it to some of those fundamental psychological structures and coordination. Like, we don't expect people to be the same in other domains. We don't expect every person to like rap music
Mm.
or jazz music or classical. There are just different people who like different sorts of music. First of all, that doesn't mean that jazz is right and rap is wrong, or
Hmm.
however you want to put it, or the same in so many other fashions or clothing or different hobbies and so forth. Yet we have this mistaken notion. And I think a lot of it is rooted in the miscategorization of most modern software development as software engineering,
Hmm.
that it is in an engineering practice, and that you can arrive at, like, the best way of erecting the angle on this pillar. No, you can't. No, you can't. Software is just not that. It has elements of that. It has fractions of that mixed up into it. Some parts of software development is more like software engineering, and other parts are very little like software engineering. And I think it took me a while too to realize this, right? It took me a while too to realize, oh, just because I've had this transcendent experience discovering Ruby does not mean that everyone else will.
Mm.
Because again, if you did a big five, like I would come out in a certain configuration. And that's part of the reason I like Ruby. If you take someone who's at the opposite ends of all of that, they'd hate it. And they do. And they do. That's what I found too, right? Like there's tons of people who think Ruby is a terrible language.
Mm.
Either they think too much flexibility, too much rope to hang yourself, too inefficient, too slow. Like there's all these laundry list of issues you can line up. And again, all that, I was going to say animosity, and sometimes it is, but that it doesn't even have to be. It can simply just be like, I don't like this.
Mm.
Um, Coexist in a world where literally there's over 1 million Rails applications made in there, hundreds of billions of dollars in enterprise value. And put all that aside, tons of people who are madly in love with Ruby as their favorite programming language of all time, including yours truly. And once I kind of realized that, or it became apparent to me over the years, I realized, you know what? This must be true on the other side too. I guarantee there are people who feel the way I feel about Ruby about Go,
Yeah,
probably, I
totally.
assume.
People
Um,
fall in love with it.
okay, good. I'm not sure that is actually true for every single programming language in the world, but
I'm sure there are. I'm
for a
sure
small enough
brain
N,
fuck and
exactly.
yeah,
For a small enough, and I'm sure that is true. And it's also true that there are tons of people who never fall in love, who never use those terms to describe their relationship to the, I just use the best tool for the job, programming language that they've chosen to. Like, I don't even have a emotional relationship
breaks my heart to hear that.
with my tooling, right? Like there's tons of people who are like that. And like we all get to coexist in the world. And even more to the point, the world is so much more interesting because this is true. Holy shit, the world would be boring as hell if, first of all, we were all the same on the big five. First of all, it would be fragile. It would be mono branch of sort of history and nature. We would be susceptible to all sorts of plagues that could wipe out the whole thing. Da da da. Um, but it was also just you'd exhausted very quickly. Like I kind of feel like I do know most of what happened or has happened in Ruby land. I'm very well versed in all of it. And
Mm.
then occasionally I dive into another community like Go, for example. We've been using Go for a bunch of proxies and so on. And I've sort of just dabbled in there. And I go like, it's like taking a trip to Japan.
Yeah,
When I did that for the first time in I think 2005, and I just went like, this is a hugely fascinating yet totally alien country and culture. And I love going here for that fact exactly.
mm.
The more the world homogenizes in that sense, the more we make everything just the same pot of everything, the less interesting it becomes. I want the internet in particular, and I think the internet, one of its main amazing accomplishments is that it's a runtime that is indifferent to its programming environment. I don't even know if there's literally ever been another major platform in the history of computing that's like that. I don't think so. Where literally you can program in any of the, I don't know how many programming languages have been in the world, hundreds. Any of the 100 programming languages ever invented can produce things that create web applications where the user doesn't mind or care. And the web as a method of delivering application also doesn't care.
Mm.
HTTP doesn't give a shit what you use to produce the text that's sent down the wire, whether you use Go or Ruby or Brainfuck or Amos. It doesn't care. And that creates such a level playing field for all these communities to sprout in a million different directions. Like there is not this homogenizing force, notwithstanding JavaScript. And I mean, this is one of the reasons I both like and don't like JavaScript. JavaScript has been a little bit of an homogenizing force and has had a level of gravity because it has this blessed position in the browser, right?
Mm.
That I don't actually think is super healthy.
Mm.
I like JavaScript. JavaScript is actually my second favorite language, but I don't like that part of it. I like individual communities who know what they are
Yeah,
and embrace that fully. I don't want Go programmers to suddenly discover dynamic typing and try to make the Go language a duck type language. No, 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 no. Please keep Go with
I
that
agree.
integral vision of what it is and how it's built. And the same thing with Ruby. You're going to add static typing to the core language over my fucking dead body. Like I will literally go, Matt, if you're listening, I will literally go to your house and knock on your door and do a hunger protest outside of it. Or maybe even more to the point, I'll just stop using the new versions. So allowing, especially the things that are pure, not all languages are. I have a sense that on the spectrum of purity of like PHP, which is a language I have great affection for. This was the first language I really got proficient in. It was the
Mm-hmm.
first language I made full products in and made money within. It was a language that turned me into a professional programmer. I love a lot about that. I wouldn't necessarily say that it is a language sort of with a high degree of structural integrity. And I don't mean in the sense that it's rickety. I mean that it doesn't have like rigid ideology bound lines. It's been like, oh, do you know what? Some people want some static typing. Let's just add that in. Some people want to add this method. Who cares if the naming is 100% consistent? Add it in. It'll be fine. Don't change. I mean,
Yeah.
in fact, if anything, I think PHP unfortunately did change a little too much towards things that were perhaps perceived as more serious or
Mm-hmm.
more engineering. I
Mm-hmm.
think adding types to PHP, in my opinion, was a mistake. Um, but anyway, that's a different, or it is related. But just this idea that we should embrace our differences. And Ruby and Rails have really been fortunate in that regard, that it was thrust into the limelight. It never achieved sort of mainstream, not only dominance, but even a footprint. Um, and that allowed it to be really strongly integrally sound.
Mm.
Like, no, very few programmers were forced into Ruby on Rails against their will with a mission to then change it and make it
Mm-hmm.
interesting. So there's been some
Mm-hmm.
attempts, but the immune system in Ruby and Rails is very strong at this point, and I don't see that happening. Um, and I think that's good. And I think this is why I love working with the web, is because it literally celebrates that. It celebrates the idea that it could be a Commodore 64 that's replying back with HTTP 1.1 and like it'll run it just fine. That's
Mm.
amazing.
I agree. I want to switch to talking about once. This is a line of products yeah, that's is it 37 Signals that put this out? Is that right?
Yes.
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 So just as a quick preamble, it's basically like a line of products that says like, hey, this thing you're paying a monthly subscription for, that's kind of dumb because you're like renting as opposed to owning something. Um, why does the world need once?
You did a good job explaining the basic premise here. Is I think the world is drowning in subscription software. And there's some irony to that because 37 Signals became a software company as a subscription software company.
Mm-hmm.
We were very early in the SaaS world, well before the term SaaS was even invented. This is all the way back in 2004, February of 2004, when we released, I think actually on the same day as Facebook, Basecamp, our project management tool, which 20 years later is still going strong and is
Mm-hmm.
still SaaS. Um, and then we've done other SaaS tools since, and I like that. But I've also grown to dislike the fact that everything is SaaS. Like for example, I like photography, and I think the best photography app is Adobe Lightroom. Why the fuck is Adobe Lightroom a subscription piece of software? For many years, it was not. It was just something I bought. And then it turned into this subscription. I'm like, okay, I guess it's just this one thing, but it's never just this one thing, right? Especially for organizations. Like, I thought I saw a stat, and this sounds incredible. Maybe it's too incredible to be true, but that the average, like, mid-sized enterprise has 80 SaaS apps that they're paying for. 80.
I
80.
know that is not an exaggeration. So, as a quick plug, the company I founded called Subble solves the same problem as once, but just by not trying to completely solve the problem, but just by like plugging in and looking at all your SaaS apps and seeing where you're wasting money. And we've
Yes.
seen from plugging into people like, oh my god, companies with 10 people could have like just dozens of SaaS apps, and it's just crazy.
And I think it's that weight that's finally. It's actually interesting how these things, like, what is it, like a drop in the water somewhere? Because I kind of feel like the institutional awareness of SaaS overload came around the same time as the consumer awareness of subscription overload,
Mm.
right? Like we went through this age where everyone had like 5 subscriptions to different streaming services, and then they
Yeah,
had 5 other things, and then at some point they realized, holy shit, I'm spending half my paycheck on subscription software,
yeah, on
and I'm not
Netflix.
owning anything, right? And unlike the World Economic Forum, they were not happy. They owned nothing, but they weren't happy about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think there's a growing awareness inside companies as well that you know what, things got a little out of hand. It got a little out of hand with, first of all, too many overlapping tools. It was one of the great advantages of SaaS is its low friction, right? You can sign up for a piece of software and you can start using it like literally seconds later. We rely on that at Basecamp. This is why we've been successful over all these years and many others as well. But that friction can also get so low that it's so easy to sign up for like 5 different packages that all do overlapping shit. Like, why do
Totally.
you have so many pieces of software where then your data is spread to the wings? It is a little over here, a little over there, a little over here. First of all, I think I just have something fundamental about that. That doesn't seem like a good idea. I'm not sure I can articulate 100% why, but like having all the data required to run our operation spread across literally 80 different tools.
Mm.
There's something about that that doesn't
What
seem
are
right.
dependencies?
It's like dependencies. That's a great way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about that. Yes, dependencies.
Mm.
Which, by the way, that was one of those differences between the Ruby world and the JavaScript world. Like odd even is a dependency.
Yeah. Yeah.
The JavaScript world, we're like
Left pad.
inconceivable that that level of functionality would be packaged as an individual dependency in Ruby land. We deal with
Mm-hmm.
a much coarser grained thing. Anyway, once tries to address this at the root, where we go like, do you know what? SaaS is in large part um, popular because the web is so good. The web is such a great software development platform that a large part of SaaS winning was because the web was just better. The browser is an amazing runtime platform. It's so easy for people to understand just the innovation of like having one navigational interface for all the different apps and so on. Just incredible, right? But that got wrapped up in SaaS, and it needn't be. It got They got married right from the beginning. A business model got married with a software distribution platform when that's not necessarily how it has to be. There are different business models that can plug into that distribution platform, and for a while, SaaS seemed like the only option because the other ways of distributing web software were really complicated. I remember getting a preview of how GitHub Enterprise used to work back in the early 2010s before containerization.
Mm-hmm.
Holy, it was like a consulting project. It was like installing SAP. It was like, all right, let's put apart a long period of time. You're going to have your own Linux machines and like, we're going to send people on site. I don't know if they actually send people on site. But it was a very laborious process of doing things. And then we've had this string of incremental improvements in the ability to package software, web software, and distribute it. Containerization is obviously the big one. We started talking about Docker. Docker is literally the one to thank for the lion's share of all of this. All of a sudden, you could take all this hardship of like, how does it run on this operating system, that operating system? What are the dependencies it needs? And just one fucking file,
Mm-hmm.
one file, and then you could do like Docker use, and you could even make it a single command line, whatever. I thought that innovation has already been internalized by programmers for like, oh, I need MySQL. Let's run it through Docker. It's so easy. And there's been attempts here and there at doing it with commercialized software. I think GitLab and other things have been distributed this way. But the target audience was also always heavily technical developer type people. And I just went like, at some point, things have gotten so good. They've gotten so easy. I bet you we can boil this down to one command. I bet you we can boil down the entire installation process from like you start with a virgin Ubuntu machine, no dependencies at all. You run one freaking command and you'll have a once product up and running and updating, auto updating, and all the other things that people like about SaaS software, right? But you will own the software. It will run on your computers. You will own the data. No one will have access to the data, and it's yours forever. I can't put you out of business, right? I can't like Google you. I can't Google graveyard you, is what I meant to say. Like, whatever, 300, 400 services they've killed. They kill a dozen every year.
Yep.
That can't happen to you if you own the Docker image. Like, it's literally you, and I guarantee you, I shouldn't guarantee anything. I've been getting into retro gaming. And one of the things that
Wait, wait,
amazes
wait, wait a second. What games are we talking about here?
Oh, we're talking about basically these sort of things.
Oh,
These
wow.
retro gaming handhelds, things that can run everything all the way back to the beginning of gaming history. And one of
Right.
the games I've been playing recently is um, Space Invaders and what's the main one I'm thinking? Asteroids.
Mm-hmm.
Asteroids is from I think 1978. Um, I'm not playing a version of Asteroids. I'm not playing a re-implementation of Asteroids. I'm playing fucking Asteroids as it was written in the mid 70s before I was born in the Atari offices. That code is running on my thing today.
That's
That's
crazy.
amazing. It is. I mean, I don't think people realize just the amount of things that had to come together for this, whatever, sub $100 device to be able to run the original code of a computer from the 70s. That's insane.
Hmm.
And it gives me such hope that, like, this version of Campfire is the first WhatsApp. It's a chat application. We basically, our main realization on this, like, subscription overload was actually Slack. I heard about some Slack builds and I couldn't believe them. What do you mean you're paying tens of thousands of dollars to run whatever, a few thousand people on Slack? That just sounds so fucking crazy. Like, this is such a commodity piece of software, yet you're being charged thousands and thousands of dollars, in some cases millions of dollars. I talked to Toby at Shopify. His Slack bill is just unfathomably large.
Hmm.
And I just went like, okay, let's start there. Let's make essentially like an 80-20 version of Slack. Like, Slack does about 400 trillion things, and it's a very good piece of software. Again, I don't have to say anything negative about Slack. It does a lot of things, and a lot of people don't even need an iota of those things.
Hmm.
Can we make a installable software package, an alternative to Slack for them that they can buy once and then they can install, run, own their own data and all the things? And then I can have this vision in my head that in 2079, someone is going to be fucking running that. They're going to be running it just like Asteroids is running on my thing now from the 78. And they're going to run it for two reasons. One is Docker has now reached escape velocity. Docker is going to be around forever.
Hmm.
I mean, forever is a long time, but I would bet good money that it's going to be around 50 years.
Yep.
It's like we still have Cobalt code and whatever. It's just such a wonderful idea and a way to encapsulate software, very akin to what's happening in the retro gaming world. And then the other thing is, I bet you that in 50 years you can still render a web page from 1997, and it will render the same way. That these two, both this way of packaging software and this way of running software, have reached such a critical mass and have such an institutional allegiance to backwards compatibility that it's going to last forever. Do you know what I can almost guarantee you? I mean, that's not exactly a stretch here. The version of Slack you run today, there's no fucking way that runs in 50 years.
Yeah.
I would
Definitely.
there's good odds it's not even, first of all, actually, if you go back, what is that, 2 years? When was the last major Slack redesign? I think it was like a year ago or something. A ton of people did not like that redesign, right? The version of Slack that literally existed 2 years ago is never going to exist again.
Hmm.
No one's ever going to be able to run it again. If
Yeah.
they like that version, too fucking bad. Run the new version or change to something else. That's not a vision of software I like.
Hmm.
And it's almost enough to turn one to Stallman-esque rants about software freedom and whatnot. And it's one thing I've had to sort of discover over time, where I went like, there's a lot of software I never want to see updated.
Yeah.
You know what? I have a Brother LH2364 whatever printer. I never, ever want to update the firmware in that fucking thing. Like, that solves a problem in a way I have no interest in any improvements, any changes, any upgrades. It just needs to do the thing I bought it from until the end of time, preferably.
Yeah.
There's a lot of software like that. In fact, this was informed by the fact that, so we started 20 years ago. The original version of Basecamp that I started programming on in the summer of 2003, literally 20 years ago, those original lines of code, at least a fair portion of them, are still in production today for customers who signed up between 2004 and 2010 when we ran that original version. We've chosen as a SaaS provider to do this crazy thing of keeping that software running 14 years after we stopped developing new features for it. We're still running it for those existing customers. It's, by the way, still $1 million business. Amazing that thing can happen. But what's even more amazing is I will talk to customers of that software, right? And I'll talk to them like, so what do you like? Do you still like Basecamp? How do you use it? And they were like, we love Basecamp. Love Basecamp. I love what you guys are doing. And I'm like, we've been doing things for 14 years, right? And they're like, no. This thing I'm running, this Basecamp, that's the one I love. They're
Mm.
not in the market at all. They can be, some of them don't love Basecamp. They just use it because that was whatever was running. Inertia does its thing, right? But there's also a contingency of people who just really like that version of Basecamp.
Yeah.
And who the fuck am I to argue, right? Why why shouldn't you be able to run that? Well, with most SaaS, almost every piece of SaaS you can't. You cannot run the original version of Slack. You cannot run the original version of whatever, Google Docs.
Mm.
You get an internally upgraded version, and that has benefits. Let's not discount that, but certainly also has drawbacks.
Yeah.
And the drawback in terms of choice and freedom for the individual user to stay with something that they like, I find increasingly problematic. And once is our attempt of swimming against the stream on that and going like, do you know what? It's not written in stone that web software has to be SaaS. We could use the advances in software packaging to make web software available in the same way that I used to be able to buy and install Adobe Lightroom.
Mm.
That is a vision of computing. Whether it works or not is a completely different thing. Maybe not enough people want this or whatever. I think it's too early to tell.
Mm.
In the early days of Basecamp, you could certainly have looked at our numbers and go like, this SaaS thing, never going to take off. So who knows? Future's going to tell. But that's what I like working for. I like to work for like these positive visions of what the future of software should look like. Whether it's directly for developers, convention over configuration and all these things, fewer knobs, or it's in the consumer space or commercial space with things like once, um, more more freedom. And again, it's such a Stallman-esque thing to say in a way that I perhaps would have ridiculed more like 10 years ago because I hadn't seen the same things. We hadn't seen the rise of Apple and Google dominate and strangle distribution for mobile platforms. We
Mm-hmm.
hadn't even conceived that that level of regression was possible. When I started working with the web in 2000, well, actually, I started working with the web in '95. But let's just say when I started working, we started working on subscription software at 37 Signals in 2003. The web was becoming the predominant software distribution platform for new software and new things. Mobile wasn't here yet. It seemed for a golden moment like all software developers were going to have the freedom to distribute whatever software they wanted, written in whatever language they wanted, and had access to the premier software computing platform. And then, to our blessing and curse, 2007 happened, and Steve Jobs goes like, "Repeat after me again. It's an internet communicator. It's an iPod. It's a, I forget what was the fucking third thing.
Camera.
It's camera. Maybe it was camera.
It was
It's
one
like
of them.
these
Yeah.
three things, right? It's the iPhone, and the iPhones again starts ramping slowly. Bauma's laughing. What do you mean $500 for an upson? Sometimes this is stupid, and then it's just Congress all right. And then we end up now 2024. Actually, let's just spool back 3 years before antitrust sort of got its wheels running. 2020. 2020. We launched Hey, our email app, right? SaaS app with mobile clients. And I go like, we have a good idea. We're going to compete with Google, with Gmail. Fucking sounds like the stupidest idea in the world, right? What, you're going to compete with a really good piece of email software that's fucking free? What are you, insane? Anyway, that's the mission we set out to do. And we thought like, all right, we're going to take the battle against Google here. And we realized, oh no, before you get to that boss, you got to clear this lower boss. And the boss is called Apple. And they guard access to the most popular in the US mobile computer amongst people who spend money on software. Wait, what?
Mm.
We have to fight them even to have the right for users who want to buy our stuff to be allowed to install that software on their device? What? What do you
Mm.
mean? This is fucking crazy. Yet we had this prolonged battle where if it had turned out the other way, we would literally, that business would have gone out of business. Hey would not have been commercially viable if we didn't have a iPhone app. 80%, 85% even, I think, of paying users on Hey use Apple devices.
Mm.
I mean, they just have such a stranglehold, right? So you go like, shit, how did this happen? How did I start my career and enjoy such success in a world where, like, if you have a good idea, you just put it on the web, and if people like it, they buy it, and
Mm.
you transact. Now there's this fucking 800-pound gorilla just standing in the middle saying, first you pay me 30%. And even if you do, I don't like your app. You can't sell to users. What? So it's in some ways, perhaps it's a curse. Like anyone who grew up as a software developer from probably 2012, 13 forward, like never knew another way. Like Apple as this dominant force in software distribution was sort of just a fact of life.
Mm.
I remember the before times. I remember the web. I remember what it was like to be able to just have a good idea and put it online and be able to convince customers to buy it directly.
Mm.
So that's again one of those positive visions I want to continue to fight for, and that's where it all ties back into the Linux thing, right? Where I go like, do you know what? I don't know if you saw the latest update of Mac OS. You can no longer is it Control Click to start an application that has not been signed and verified by Apple.
What?
So they took out that hot or short key or shortcut for starting software that has not been notarized by Apple. Now you have to go through a super convoluted step dance to figure out how do you actually allow the software that you've downloaded to run on your computer.
I'm aware of the like right click and click open. Is that?
That's the one I think they're killing.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what I'm gonna do now.
So again, I think it's still physically possible. You just have to do a deep
I really
dive
don't like
menu.
that. I don't like that. It's.
I don't like that fucking at all either. And what I like even less about the specifics of that is that I don't like the trajectory at all that Apple has been on for now quite a while. And like, it's not like they didn't tell us
Mm.
when the iPad was really hitting its stride, and I think it was mid 2010s. Steve Cook at some point goes out and say the iPad is our idealized incarnation of what the future computing should look like.
Some ideal.
That should have been a fucking chilling warning to anyone who cares about computing.
Yeah.
That a lockdown device where you can basically do fucking nothing that Apple doesn't allow you to do, that's what they see as the future pinnacle of computing. Fuck me. That is really dystopian in its literal sense of the word, right? Now, what's so fascinating is that, okay, so this is happening, and this is before Apple even puts out the M1 chips on the laptop, right? Like these are computers. Apple makes good computers. They've made leaps forward with computers. They should be our allies. And that's actually what I thought they were for literally 20 years. I was
Mm.
the biggest Apple advocate and converted half my student class. I started university in what 2001. Got a MacBook there. No, sorry, 2003. I had a MacBook. Everyone else had a PC. Everyone. One MacBook, right? By the end of our study, half. And I will take some personal credit for forcefully crusading imperialistically around going like, that PC's dumb. Look at this iBook. Isn't it great? So we made advertisements for Apple. Jason and I, my business partner, in I think 2006 or something, recorded like an ad for Apple that they
Mm.
used on their developer side. Like we've been huge Apple fans, and I've been a huge Apple fan because I think they made good computers, and I
Mm.
think they were aligned with people who wanted to use those computers to build the kind of stuff that I wanted to build. And then obviously, first the iPhone happens and it's this blowaway success, and then the iPad happens and it's also not the same success, but still a success. And suddenly the Mac is this minority part of the business, and you end up realizing, as we're talking about mental models that can drift, you end up realizing, oh shit, my mental model of Apple's wrong.
Mm.
They're no longer on the same side of like computing as I am. They have a
Yeah.
different vision of computing. And what's happening with the Mac now, I think, is just it's going to move. Every iteration is going to move closer to their ideal interpretation of what computing should be. And I think that is the literally 180-degree opposite direction of where I want to go. And that's what I find actually not just satisfying, but holy shit, what a relief that Linux exists. I mean, if Linux did not exist, we would be in the same shithole we're in mobile. You can
Yeah.
get either poison or poison. Do you want Google? Do you want Apple? Both of them suck in terms of the future prospects of computing. On desktop, you can either pick Apple or Windows, or thankfully Linux.
Yeah.
Linux exists there in the middle, offering us a way to have actually a say on the future computing. Um, Holy shit. I mean, thank you, Linus, and everyone else over literally 3 decades um, for making that choice possible. Otherwise, I don't know if I just like chug it all out and go like, all right, I'm going back to potato farming or something.
Yeah. Like I need my computer to understand that as far as it's concerned, I'm God, and I wish on a Mac there was just a toggle I could toggle in the settings saying like I'm an
Right.
adult, like just let me do my shit.
Yeah.
But yeah,
No.
It is funny that things have just gotten worse. Like, I can even remember, honestly, even back when I was making video games in high school, I'd make a game, I'd export it to a .exe file because I was on Windows, and then my
Yeah,
antivirus would say, "This is a virus." It's like, how the fuck could you possibly know or think that if I just made
right,
it?
right.
So
It's not on the white list.
that's
You've
right.
not been pre-approved to the party.
That's right. And
Go
it's
away.
like,
Right? When you're like, wait, I remember when the first computer I got was an Amstrad CPC, and the fucking thing booted into BASIC. Like the first thing you see, you turn the thing on, BASIC prompt, cursors blinking. What do you want to program today, sir? Like
mm,
literally, you were in command of the thing on its most fundamental level. Now, I do think there is, and this goes to the point of whether the product sensibilities in the Linux community has helped or hurt it or whatever. Um, I do think there's room to recognize that computing has gotten better for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who would not be using computers if their computer still booted straight into BASIC, right? So we can recognize that and still like, but there's a way to marriage what that was, our ability to command the hardware. If we said like, hey, do you know what, jump, the hardware would damn well jump if that was hardware wise possible, not go like, I'm sorry sir, Apple has decided that jumping is not for today. um that's not a constraint that's there. But yeah, unfortunately it doesn't seem like the future of those mainstream platforms is in that direction. And with Windows it's really interesting because Windows, I remember I switched to Apple originally because I was switching away from Windows. I hated the Microsoft of the late 90s. I despised the Bill Gates of the cut off their air supply era, right? Just an absolute sort of stain on computing. I could not wait to get away. I was very begrudgingly using a Windows machine at that time because
mhm,
I kind of felt like that was the only option. My beloved Amiga had kind of hit a dead end. Commodore had gone bankrupt, and all the other stuff. Um, and then the Mac comes around with a Unix powered operating system that does all those things. And it has huge amounts of compromises, right? Like the first OS 10 machines were fucking rough. They were
mhm,
slow as hell. Those PowerPC 800 megahertz CPUs were no match for what Intel could put out on the PC side. But I was like, I don't care. I don't care if it's going to be 50% slower. I want a machine that isn't owned by Bill Gates. And now history is coming full circle around, and I would actually categorize Microsoft as the far lesser evil threat to the future of computing than Apple is. I mean, Microsoft, even though I don't love everything they do, certainly not everything around the AI stuff and whatnot, but their respect for backwards compatibility. Oh, I've grown very impressed with that. The fact that you
mm,
can run a Windows 95 program on a modern Windows machine today is nothing short of kind of incredible. Like
mm,
that doesn't exist in the same way in the Mac world. Um, so anyway, all these things go around, but I get to the fact of like, do you know what? I want to be on a platform that is it's like what you're saying about the Go thing. You pick up Go, right? And you go like, oh, I kind of like this. Then you go into a Go community forum and you go like, oh, these people are not like me at all. They like very different things than me. Am I in the right room? Maybe
mm,
I'm in the wrong room. That's what I realized with Apple. I'm in the wrong room. This room is not taking me towards the future of computing that I'd like to see. Linux is. And I had outdated mental models about what Linux was and how nerdy you had to be to figure it out, and whether I could be an enjoyable place to be, an aesthetically pleasing place to be. And then I updated those mental models. I realized, holy shit, it's not just good; it's freaking great. Not without its flaws and drawbacks and whatever, but it's freaking great. And it's very aligned with the future computing that I'm interested in. Oh man, I was just yeah, thrilled that that exists. Thrilled that there was this whole world for me to discover. That's half the fun. If you just, I think that's part of the problem sometimes. And I did the same problem. The first thing I tried to do when I switched from the Mac to Linux was I tried to set up VS Code to be a copy of TextMate.
mm.
I tried to replicate my Mac environment exactly one to one on Linux, and that was always going to be a cheap copy.
Yeah.
It was always going to fail. I was always going to notice the ways where whatever the Mac GNOME skin was not quite pixel perfect, right? You can't do it like that. You're going to end up feeling like you're just using the cheap version, and that doesn't have a happy future. Um, the breakthrough for me was to realize, all right, you know what? I'm going to adopt Linux on Linux terms. I'm gonna I'm not gonna remap my super key to be the alt key such that it fits my muscle memory from a Mac
That's
keyboard.
funny because I have done that, and I have been noticing that it is kind of painful because
It
it's
is.
not perfect.
It
Yeah.
is, and it's never going to be perfect, and it's going to be this cheap copy. And I don't think actually you're never going to end up in a place where you're there positively. Where
Mm,
like I'm on Linux because I want to be on Linux.
mm,
You're going to end up with like I'm on Linux still because I'm really mad at Apple,
yeah.
even though I want to make my Linux machine just like the Apple. That no way to live, no way to live. So once I realized that, and it took me a while, um, that was when the world opened. That was when the oyster opened up, and like there was just like fucking pearls over the place. It's like what NeoVim? Oh shit! Oh Lazygit? Oh my god! Oh Isa? What the hell? Oh Alacrity? Oh Zellige? What? And then I ended up going like, oh yeah, I can live here. Like this can be a nice place to be. Um, so that's what I would say for anyone who's considering this. First of all, you got to accept the changing computing platforms, especially if you've used one for as long as a lot of people have used the Mac, like 5 years plus, decade plus, 2 decades plus. You don't do that in a day. That's not how the brain works. That's not how it works with anything. You don't break any habit, muscle or otherwise, in that amount of time. You have to go almost upfront and say, I'm going to give this 2 weeks and I'm going to stick with it even when I fucking want to chuck this thing out the window. I want to stick with this thing when it's even still frustrating because otherwise it's just not going to happen, right? You're going to get to day 3 and you're going to go, I've wasted so much fucking time and I still don't know how to close this file.
Yeah.
Um, so and that's hard, right? That is not an easy task to ask
Yeah.
people to do that. And this is why there's such inertia in computing, right? I actually think people are more likely to change their insurance company than they are to change their computing platform. And people don't change their insurance companies very often
Mm,
unless they have a traumatic experience that forces that. Inertia is one of the most powerful forces in the human universe.
mm.
Which is why it's so important that to unlaunch that, we have to have like some emissaries, some early wanderers who are like, hey, I just came from your tribe. I used to live there for 20 years, but I saw this oasis over here. You should come over. Come over. It's actually pretty cool. I made it nicer. So, like, when you arrive at this oasis, it's going to be slightly easier for you to arrive than it was for me. That's what I've been trying to do with Amakoop.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, come join the party. And again, not everyone will, not everyone should. Lots of people love their Mac, right? Like I, you and I can perhaps talk about like this is a terrible future of computing, whatever. And then there are people who go like, no, I think Apple
I'm
should just
safe. I feel safe. Yeah.
right. Like, wouldn't it be better if Apple just decided whether every piece of software was safe or unsafe? Um, and I mean, okay, fair enough. Like, continue to buy your Apple. That's an opinion. It's
Hmm.
not mine. Um, and let's self-select, right? Like part of giving up on the crusades in programming languages is to give up the crusade. Period. Like it just doesn't work to forcefully by the sword convert people that way.
Mm.
Convert people by going like, hey, this oasis is a lovely place to be. If you're not happy with the city you're in and maybe it's a little dirty, you should come out here. And maybe over time we will build up this oasis and it'll become even bigger and you're going to help us and all the things, right? And I think that's where Linux is right now. It's a really exciting time where something that's like actually ancient in computing terms, right? Like we've literally had like Linux for like half the time of the modern computing era.
Mm.
Is that right? Yeah, almost, right? Like from whatever late 50s to now,
Hmm.
almost half the time, Linux has been with us, and to be able to rediscover that gem exists, um, that is just incredible. So anyone listening, if they are on a Mac, and especially if they're like terminally infected, right? They like living in terminal and they like working with that. You should give modern Linux a try. I think if you commit to the 2 weeks, I'd give it better than 50% odds that you can stick.
Totally. All right. Do you have a question? Do you have time for a question on philosophy? Because I know you're one of the few
Oh,
programmers who also philosophize a lot online.
shoot.
So, what is so bad about attachment?
That's one of the big ones, and it's a really interesting one because I think, especially if you think of Buddhism, that's probably one of the main tenets of that, where you go like attachment is the root of suffering. I forget what the exact Buddha wording is of this. I think it actually basically something like it is suffering.
Mm.
Attachment is suffering to some extent. And the Stoics, which is sort of the Western interpretation of a lot of those Buddhist ideas, have similar ideas that um, if once you become attached to something, you become a prisoner to it. And if you realize instead that like your true freedom is your inner world and your development in your inner world and development of your character and so forth, you're going to be a whole lot more resilient towards adversity if you can essentially afford to lose more or less everything. The Stoics even went so far as to build up this whole training program, mental training program for how to become better at dealing with attachment. A negative visualization is what they call it, which is a with a principle instead of like it's almost the opposite of forget what it was called. There's a modern thing like think it and it will happen, right? The Stoics went like, do you know what? Think about all the terrible things that could happen. Think about all those, just such that you build up your resilience to terrible events because terrible things will happen. It's just that kind of world. You're not going to make it through the end without anything terrible happening to
Mm-hmm.
you. Most humans will go the duration and will have multiple terrible things happen to them. And some of those humans are utterly destroyed by it. All of them will have a hard time with it. Like that's the definition of a terrible thing, something you have a hard time with it. But some people will recover more easily and more
Mm.
successfully than others. You should be one of those people. You should be one of those people where, when faced with adversity, whether personal or professional or otherwise, you're the resilient one. You're the one who gets back on their feet faster and starts going again and keeps going. And dealing with attachment is one of the central themes in that building of resilience. And it's one of those things that's such a fascinating topic and also really difficult because I think no, just think we know that humans are pre-programmed with loss adversity, right?
Yeah.
Humans would rather not lose $50 than win 100, right? Like we're really loss adverse in a way that like
Mm.
economists would say are irrational or whatever, but that's how we're hardwired. So if you're gonna sort of make it through and be the resilient, strong character that hopefully you desire to be, you got to deal with that. You
Mm.
really got to deal with it, and you got to deal with it head on. Now, what's interesting to me is I've been on this stoic journey for when did I get introduced to that? Maybe that was Tim Ferriss in like 2005 or something. I think when he started writing about it. So a good almost maybe 20 years. I'm not going to say I've come full circle on it because I haven't at all. I think Stoicism is still the main mental operating system that I try to bootload every
Mm-hmm.
morning because I find it so powerful and so calming. What I have also found, and that's perhaps even more true in the Buddhist version, I've been reading a bit on that side. I think you can also take it too far.
Mm-hmm.
Literally not being attached to anything, maybe it's making for a more tranquil mind, but also I don't find that enjoyable. There are actually moments where my relationship to certain things like sport. Um, I've competed in motor car racing for quite a long time, and when I started on that, I was quite attached. I was quite attached to outcomes and successes and so forth. And I've, as part of detachment or whatever you will, reducing my reliance on attachment, also become less attachment to those things. Like what is the outcome of a motor race I'm part of?
Yeah.
And I remember still the feelings, the sort of more stronger emotions that Stoicism is so much about, right? It's about keeping a calm mind, not being
Mm.
overcome with emotions. Emotions are actually sort of the negative for it. And then I think like, but there was actually something enjoyable about those swings.
Yeah.
Like there is something enjoyable about getting worked up about the outcome of a sports match or something.
Mm.
That
Mm.
is perhaps certainly in Buddhism and also in Stoicism is kind of frowned upon. At least the official canon of scriptures and so forth, right? You're about to keep like a steady line, not be
Mm.
too moved by anything, just like oscillate around this steady line where I actually think like, you know what, some of the human experience is to have some of those tips, at least get more of them. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not a scholar in either of these things, certainly not on Buddhism. Um, and maybe these things are as starkly in opposition as I present them to be here. But that's at least one of the things that I've found. I say overall, most humans who have not studied any of these mental operating systems can benefit tremendously
Mm.
from growing less attached to things they cannot control. That's how Stoicism puts it, right?
Mm.
It divides the world into basically two things: the things that you can control, which is your own reaction to things, which is your own disposition, and then the things you cannot control. Those are the outcomes of, for example, a sports match or a motor race or all these other things. You
Mm.
can't control them. Don't get in that invested into things you can't control. Invest all of that energy into building up the things you can control, like your reactions.
What interests me about that, so I also like last year spent a bit of time looking into Buddhism, and it is very heavy on the acceptance side of things. It's just like accept, accept,
Yes,
accept.
yes,
And
yes.
I think about the Serenity Prayer. That's like, God, give me the
Yep.
strength to change the things I can, the grace to
The
accept the things
version of
I
the same thing.
can't,
Yes,
and the
yes,
wisdom to know the difference. And I feel like that last part is so crucial. And it's
yes,
like you can just go, I'm just going to accept everything, but it's like, yeah, but there's also a lot of things that you can change.
yes,
And
yes.
I feel like I'm still on the lookout for a philosophy that can just tell me here's how you decide what you can and can't change, and therefore where to put your emotional resources.
And
Because
you're not going to find it.
that's
That's
right, that's right. It's too complex. You can't
it
have a
is. It
philosophy that
is.
you just
And
write
I
down.
think also to some extent that is liberating, because if you could literally just find an operating system that was pre-programmed for all the responses you should have to the world and everything that happens in it, you'd no longer be human. You
Mm,
would literally just be an automaton, right? You would already know how to react to all the things because it could be pre-programmed according to a certain algorithm. And thankfully, we have not discovered that algorithm. Now, that doesn't mean we actually shouldn't try searching for it.
mm,
It's just like more of an individualized search, right? Like we fork. There's a base operating system, either Buddhism or Stoicism or even Christianity, and then you fork and you put in your own patches to deal with some of the vulnerabilities and whatever the stuff that comes up. Um, and I mean that's part of the pleasure of like you're still involved in your life. You still literally have free will, and everything has not been preordained, and so forth. So I think that I mean you should be on the march for it, and I think at least I'm trying to imagine in my head what would have triggered me to look into Stoicism earlier because I kind of sort of wish I did.
mm.
Stoicism to me, discovering Stoicism, it's not quite like discovering Ruby. I think that was more immediately inflection point, but I think
Yeah.
Stoicism has almost had as big of an impact on my mental models. But I had like a homegrown version of that. I basically didn't have anything to fork from. I was just trying to build from first principles. Like, let's just start with sand, now make a CPU, now come up with assembler, whatever, of how I wanted to process the world. And the
Mm,
reason I became attracted to Stoicism was like, it felt like just a more refined version of that. It was
mm.
like, what if those thoughts had 2,000 years to cook? It'd probably be better.
Yeah.
And of course it was, right? Um, yeah, so I think, I mean, still adopting a philosophy, trying some out, right? This is the other thing. Just so with programming languages, I didn't know up front that like Ruby was going to be the one that just sort of just fit, right? Like I tried a bunch of different things. I tried Java, I tried PHP,
Mm,
ASP.NET, I tried Perl, I tried Python, tried
mm,
a bunch of different languages. Um, it was Ruby that fit, and the only way I could know that was by trying it. So I think this is one. I mean, a lot of religious thinkers maybe this is blasphemy, right? But to some extent, trying out some of these operating systems. And that's what's so interesting that some of these operating systems are overtly religious, like Christianity
yeah.
or whatever. Um, and some of them are not in the same way. Like Stoicism is not overtly religious. There's no deities that are baked into the system and whatever. There's some idea of the universe and living according to nature that you can summarize the same way. Buddhism is also has some of the things and whatever. Maybe that's somewhere halfway in between. But like they're all operating systems. They're all ways of processing the world and
Mm,
trying to make sense of it and your place in it. And I do think that having knowledge of different operating systems will help you. And for some people, they will discover one operating system and go like, "Yep, that's the one." Now others will just get theirs pre-installed. Like, yeah, I grew up in a Catholic household, and that's why we go to mass. Okay, first of all, all power to that.
mhm.
In fact, if anything, I think one of the now we're really getting into the weeds here, but one of the problems of modern day is that there's not enough pre-installation.
Totally.
There's way too many folks who are just being left with like an open boot drive, and they're like, oh well, I'm going to put my CPU and assembler language and whatever together from scratch. And the most important principle here is just consent. If I say it's good, then it's good. uh, I think that experiment has failed. And this has been one of the main things I've realized over the last, especially 10 years, just going from, I remember Bill Maher's Religulous. I think it came out in late 2000s or something, where he just makes fun of religion and points out all the ways they're stupid. And
Mm.
like, he's actually right in a lot of particular minor instances of that, right? There are a lot of stupid things. So a lot of these operating systems, the ones that endure, they're like 2,000 years old or more. How would they not have bugs?
COBOL of cultural belief system.
Exactly. How would they not have bugs and dead code and whatever things that doesn't correspond to modern whatever? Okay, yes, recognize that, try to debug it, try to update it, try to patch it. But also, or not Steve, Joel Spolsky, one of my favorite essays, even though I don't always agree with it, is like, I think it's from 2001. Don't rewrite. And he wrote this about, I think it was the Mozilla rewrite,
Hmm.
that like rewriting Netscape from scratch set back Mozilla so far that they could never catch back up. Rewriting a mental operating system is really, really difficult, and you're
Mm.
not going to get it right in your lifetime. Like operating systems, literally, mental operating systems literally take hundreds of years, if not millennia, to sort of hone and perfect,
Mm.
or not
Mm.
even perfect because they're never going to be perfected, but like make good and make just viral enough, just have enough stories and allegories and whatever that like normal people can sort of understand them, and then also make them resilient enough and also make them adaptive enough to their environments and all sorts of that. Like to think that we should just like not boot up anything, that we should just like, all right, that's a civilization, we're not going to pre-program anything, we're just like, you choose whatever
Mm.
you want. That experiment, I think I used to believe in, and I think it's been a pretty resounding failure.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience, like the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and all that stuff. I mean,
Yes.
in high school, I was at a Catholic high school, so I had plenty of reasons to hate religion just by being in that environment, having to do
Right.
prayers in the morning and always depressing
Yeah.
prayers
Yeah.
were chosen for some reason. And so I was all like, yeah, this is all great. But then you do realize that there's something there. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And we've definitely done that. And there's
Yes.
many people right now trying to find a way to salvage the good stuff. And it's just it's there's like a question about like, do you need to have some mystical element to it? Like, do you have to have some like claims about the afterlife or something to have a belief system that everyone can get around, or is it possible to just kind of be, let's say, atheist, but then also have like just the Stoic stuff? And I think that's an open question. We're going to find out whether you can
I
have.
don't actually think it's that open, unfortunately. I used to, the School of Life, what's his name? Shit, it escapes my mind. The School of Life have been advocating basically secular churches
Mm.
for a long time.
Which is just obviously well, hang on. So are you about to say that that's absurd? Because I feel like that's absurd.
I think there's something in there where the idea you were just talking about, can we capture the good parts of religion without
Mm.
the metaphysical or supernatural stuff, right? And I think that's what the secular churches were
Mm-hmm.
trying to do. How can we
Mm-hmm.
capture the community and the virtues and the moral instruction and all these other good things that I think a lot of people at least would recognize, not all, but a lot of people would recognize as good things out of religion. Can we capture those without the package?
Mm.
And I think Bill Maher was on that with religious. We don't need this. We can have good moral institution. Ricky Gervais had been on this many times, right? Like one of his great jokes is like, um, some religious person asked, like, well, if God doesn't tell you that murder is wrong, why wouldn't everyone just go around murdering? And he goes, well, I murder just as much as I want, which is absolutely not at all,
Yeah.
right? Like, and he's sort of an avowed atheist, and has a lot of funny jokes about it. And I can recognize all of those critiques, both from Bill Maher and Ricky Gervais and Dawkins and so forth, and still go like, okay, well, I kind of feel like we've had an opportunity to run your experiment
Mm.
on like a broad population for some time. Like religious rates have been going down and whatnot. Like your side of the argument has been winning. Has that improved things? Are we better off?
Mm.
I I don't think so. To just to be blunt, I mean, we
Mm.
could certainly argue about that, and some things are better off, and some things are not better off, and da, da, da. On a whole, are more people in a good place where they know their place in the world? They have sort of the security of that. No, I don't think they are, and I am very susceptible to the idea that some of it comes with, um, even if it's supernatural, the belief of an afterlife is a common belief. The
Mm.
belief of a higher power and that there's meaning with everything and like what was before the universe. And I just started reading the Tao,
Hmm.
um, Confucianism and that sort of stuff. And it's the same fucking. You look at that, and which is also not overtly deistic. The Tao is not a deistic thing. It's more like a Stoicism's sense of nature and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
according to the universe and so forth. But they all have that. Like they all have at the core a higher power,
Mm.
like something that makes the whole thing make sense. And I think if you look at the existentialist Sartre and whatever, right? You're like, oh, you're just thrown into this world. Nothing makes sense. It's a cold and uncaring universe. Um, all you have to do is you have to find your own path. And I actually like a lot of the essentialist writing. I love Camus and so forth. But you also go like, this is not a this operating system you're presenting existentialism is not compatible with most brains.
Yeah.
I don't think when they run that, we don't end up in a good place. We end up in this weird place where suddenly the golden calf becomes consent theory. But like literally anything and everything goes as long as like two consenting adults or one consenting adult is on it. And I just go like, on further reflection, I don't believe that to be true. Um, Now, very open question. What the hell do you do with that? Like, and I say that, I said a lot of positive things about religion, right? I'm not a religious person. I don't have a supernatural belief.
Mm.
I sort of kind of wish I did to some extent
Same,
because
same.
some of it
I'm
sounds
jealous.
nice. Like, I like the idea of believing that, like, I'm not just worm food, but like after that, there's going to be puffy clouds and I'm gonna whatever program all day on my favorite mechanical keyboard or whatever idea you could have of what heaven is gonna be, right? Which by the way is really funny. George Orwell has this wonderful essay about why I think it was a leftist critique, but his critique was essentially why is it that no one can articulate what heaven is except in its absence of heaven is a place where you don't have to work all the time. Heaven is a place where you always have enough money. Like it's all very fuzzy. And then everyone seemed to be able to articulate hell very specifically.
Yeah,
None
you'll
of
be
these
on fire and
there's these
you'll be getting
guys with
poked by
horns,
people.
and you're in a fucking cauldron of fire being burned for hundreds of years, and there's pitchforks, and like that's very vivid, right? Um, which gets to this leads into this critique is like first of all, and this one Dostoevsky comes up with too. Like humans wouldn't fucking know what to do with heaven
Mm.
if they arrived in heaven. They'd give it 10 minutes and then they'd fucking start smashing things just for something unexpected to happen. I think that's his line
Mm.
out of Notes from Underground, which is a wonderful book. Um, and you just go in all of this like, yeah, okay, I see all the value of religion. I think actually society in very many ways was better structured and more cohesive and whatever when it was more prevalent force. Um, I don't know how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
Mm. Well, yeah, I think that, maybe if Stoicism becomes more and more popular, it may be that there's just enough there. Just the fact that it was come up with by like Greek guys 2,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, however long it was, like maybe there's just enough mysticalness in that you don't need to invoke a deity to be able to get behind it. But yeah, I think.
Yeah. So what makes me slightly skeptical in that, and I say that as someone who very much enjoys Stoicism. I mean, it is my main source, as I said, of operating system pre-programming. Um, but it also has this tendency sometimes when like there aren't these other parts, then it pulls in. There is a stereotype of a stoic Western California dude who's a little too much into ice baths and
Yeah.
whatever that guy on YouTube. Longevity and some of these things where you just go like, oh shit. But maybe that's also, do you know what? There's not going to be a perfect operating system. Not like fucking any of the old ones were perfect. They
Mm.
all had serious material flaws. Maybe those flaws were less, and this is what we're learning now, than what the absence of those operating systems is offering us. I think that's a very fair critique.
Mm.
One Jordan Peterson is very articulate on, I'd say.
Mm.
Um, but still, it leaves us with a lot of sort of consternation without necessarily any good answers. I feel like most of the proposals I've seen, to the extent that they've actually been tried, pretty modest uptake on it. That, like, again, maybe it is to get a blockbuster viral mental operating system going, you need
You
a
might need
little
a messiah.
pizzazz. You
You
need a
might
little
need
explosions and a god that shoots fire and
yeah.
some of these other things. And maybe that just doesn't work anymore. Like
Mm,
maybe Hollywood actually killed that, right? Like now you can fucking see superhuman hero movies and all that stuff. Like maybe it just doesn't work. And
mm.
then what does work? I mean, the operating systems or viruses, I would actually call it. I mean, now we're really getting into territory we
Memes,
don't want to
basically.
talk. Memes or mind viruses, as the good Elon would like to label some of these ideas that's come up, right? That the things that are now um, what do you call it? Optimal or adapted to the environment are pretty fucking dark,
Mm.
right? Like they take society in really bad places really quickly, and that still leaves us like, what the fuck do we do? Clearly, it is still possible to infect societies with the positive word would be sort of I don't know actually if religion is even a positive word in those people's own vocabulary, but like
Spirituality.
but maybe there's some of that, or maybe it's just like some sense of the right side of history. That was one way of framing some of these things for a while. Um, that like that can still sort of work, right? So we're still able to very quickly, actually shockingly quickly, although maybe not so quickly. If you take the ideology of right side of history, for example, right, there's roots all the way back to the 20s, even back to the 1800s, and certainly to the 60s, right? Like that's where a lot of the long march through the institutions and all that stuff. You can Google some of those terms if you'd like to find out more. But some of those things got planted, and then maybe now what we're seeing is basically just the final outcome of it, and just looks like it kind of went crazy in the last 10 years. But actually, that's a 60-year march through the institutions, as some of these people would talk about.
Hmm.
But clearly, we are able to influence how people think. Like that is still there.
Mm.
Can we find essentially like a positive mind virus? Can we find a way? And that's, I mean, that is what religion is to some extent, right? Like detractors would call Christianity a negative mind virus, I guess, if you don't like Christianity or whatever. And it's not like they're all the same either. So, I mean, it's not about equivalency here. I don't think there's
Mm.
equivalency. I
Mm.
think there is different religions and thought processes and ideologies leads to very, very different outcomes.
Mm.
And some of them are terrifyingly worse than others. Um, but can we come up with a good one? Like, can we restore those good parts of what religion brought to the table in a way that breaks the curve of adoption, the adoption curve, right? We've been on this trailing curve for a long time.
Mm.
Um, can I find, just like me speaking about myself, can I find one of those? I like to believe in something greater and bigger and whatever. And Stoicism is some of that from some aspects, but not a uniform theory of
Hmm.
everything the same way that a full on religion is, right? Like a
Yeah.
religion, like, that's a prepackaged program here. Like, here's your place in the world, and here's your relationship to the deity, and here's how it's mediated, and here's how you should act, and so forth. Um, sometimes, I mean, I'll drop another reference here. Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm is one of those books that really cooked my noodle,
Hmm.
which is essentially about what do we do with all this freedom? So we won our freedom from feudal society. We've won our freedom from oppressive religions. Now you are, as the existentialists would say, you're thrown into this world and it's up to you to figure it out. And a lot of people go like, well, fuck that. No, thank you. All this freedom, totally anxiety inducing,
Yeah.
totally not what I would. Can you just tell me what to do, please?
Yeah.
You were hinting at that a little bit, right? Can I find an operating system that will just kind of give me more specific guidance about more specific things? And I
Mm.
think again, this is one of the things you can have that, or you can have the adaptability. Like Christianity is actually, if you just take that, quite specific about a great number of things. What are you supposed to do in that situation? And
Which
is
is
there
good,
goat
right?
involved?
It's
Can you do
good
this?
if you're a farmer 2,000 years ago. It's not as useful in the modern times where there's this sprawling complexity.
Yes. And I don't think we've seen an updated version of that, right?
Yeah.
Like Christianity in particular, and many of the other religions of the time, they were very specific about all sorts of things. And a lot of them were quite practical in like, whatever. Uh, Judaism were like, you shouldn't eat, what is it, pigs or
Shellfish.
whatever. There's all these sort of things that are historically anchored into things that made a lot of sense in that time and place. And then there are other things that are timeless truths, right? Um, and those timeless truths, that's the parts we now take. I'm like, this is a good part of the religion. We should focus on those part. We should not focus on the over adapted, very specific parts that made sense 2,000 years ago.
Mm.
But maybe those things are still necessary, right? Like, so
Yeah.
can we get more of that today? Can we get something that has some of those specific things? Here's some good tips on how to live.
Mm.
Is that what self help is? Then I think, oh shit, that didn't, whatever was there didn't hit critical mass either.
Mm.
Maybe that's not also possible. I mean, 2,000 years ago, how many people were on Earth? Like, I don't know, a few 100 million. Now we
Mm.
have going on 10 billion by the middle of the century. Maybe it's like JavaScript. Like, just forget it. You're not going to come up with one operating system, one religious thought
That's right.
process
Yeah.
that's going to be
Like,
able to do it. You're going to get up with these sects, or I mean, I think that's a negatively. I don't even mean that a negative word. I just mean that in a religion that's not like all encompassing, right? Um, I haven't found one, like not one that gives me the level of specificity of like don't
mm.
eat shellfish.
Mm.
Um, and if there are days where I would like to escape from freedom, where I would very much like, yeah, I'd like a little more prescription.
Totally.
Um, and it's so interesting too. Is one. So I'm immigrated to the U.S. from Denmark, and Denmark is a far more prescriptive society. There's
Mm.
far more social norms. They're far more broadly shared. They're far more severely enforced. Some people might have heard of Janteloven, which is sort of a way of creating social cohesion. Don't believe you are anything. Don't believe you're better than other people. Whatever. That's a kind of operating system, by the way.
Mm.
One that certainly also had negative consequences. And then the U.S., where we're basically, of all the societies I've spent time in, is the most you do whatever the hell you want.
Mm.
Pursuit of happiness is a very individual pursuit. It's very existentialist to some extent. That's up to you, man. You figure it out. Do your thing, right?
Mhm.
No one is saying do your thing in Denmark. I don't know if there's even a fucking Danish expression for do your thing. I'm not saying that no one believes that. I'm just saying that's not a cultural value that like goes on a fucking t-shirt.
Mm.
Um, and and I like some of that, right? But then
Mm.
I went back to Denmark for 3 years during the pandemic, and I went like, oh shit, this is also nice. I really like the cohesiveness. I like the homogeneity of a society that has very shared values,
Mm.
strong social norms that allow my fucking kids at preteen to go on the metro by themselves at 9 o'clock at night. I mean, I referenced Japan earlier. A lot of people go to Japan, they go like, "Oh, it's so clean. There's no crime. There's no." Yeah, I mean, they run an operating system that runs pretty much most of society. It's got some pretty strong social norms, and it's keeping that version of what they want that society to be in very tight check, right?
Mm.
And again, that's stifling for some people in some regards, and America has a different version of that. But I can look at both of those things and say, like, I personally like a lot of things about America, but I also like the things that are really unique to Japanese culture or Danish culture. And a large part of that is actually far more prescriptive. Those are very prescriptive societies for the members of those societies, how you should act, how you should live, what's good, what's bad, whatever. Even to the point of shared sort of interests and songs and ways of acting. I mean, one of the things, just a quick anecdote, when you arrive in Copenhagen airport and you walk out, you will invariably see a large number of people standing with Danish flags, waving those flags when their relatives come home. They're just like,
That's
yay, we're
bizarre.
Danish. This is awesome. And you've been abroad and now you're home to Denmark, and Denmark is great. I mean, I'm just sort of adding
Yeah.
comments here. If if you stood in Portland airport with a bunch of American flags, waving them back and forth, you'd get coded as a certain individual. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure most Portlanders would kind of be on your side of that
Mm.
divide, however that is, right? That's really interesting, right? It's really interesting that something as being proud of your nationality, as most Danes, I would say, they're quite proud, maybe sometimes to a fault. Um, but they're like, yeah, this is good. We're proud of Denmark, and Denmark's a great country, and we should do great things. And then you come to America, and you're like, oh shit, that's not a universally shared value.
No.
We're not like just all proud of being Americans.
Even
That
just flying the
there's something.
flag is a controversial
Yes, right.
decision.
And like again, just to try to take an objective perception of it, um, you can see how certain expressions or whatever things end up being coded,
Mm.
right? Like that side I don't like, they're doing the thing, so now I can't do the thing, even if I perhaps wanted to, right? Even if I perhaps thought like, actually, the American flag is good, but now the other side is taking that point, so I can't use it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, it's so one of the other things I found in all of this is, first of all, holy shit, the world's complicated,
That's
and I
right.
mean that in both that it is and it isn't. Like some of these universal truths, they're not very complicated and all. And religion, some of them have these great kernels, and they'll just literally. One of the things I find reading Stoicism is the amazement. Like I'm reading a fucking book that's 2,500 years old. How is he talking with such specificity about specific situation? I feel like I'm in right now in intra-human communication.
Mm-hmm.
How's that possible? How has nothing changed in 2,500 years? And probably much further than that. I just don't have the texts. But like the diagnosis of human psychology, for example, that is inherent in Stoicism, amazingly apt. Not
Yeah,
all of it.
not much has changed. It's kind of like
No,
Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun.
exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
at least
And
in
you
terms of
go like,
human interaction and human behavior.
yes. So there is obviously some of that that's like eternal truth and their higher truth. And then on the other hand, in sort of the more specific concrete sense, no one fucking knows anything. Don't know where we're going. We don't know what's happening. We don't know what's up. We don't know what's down. We don't know what's true. We don't know what's false. It's a very disorientating, and that's what Eric Fromm's Escape from Freedom is about. Uh, Being set free from sort of universal truths and whatever, and everything is. This is what postmodernism is about, right? Like deconstructing everything, and like everything is relative and it's all in the eye of the beholder, and it's whatever. Is first of all, I don't know where I am at that. Is this fundamentally true? Is it not true? I don't know. I don't think it's helpful.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't think it's helpful. I don't think it's helpful that we all have our own personal truth. That I don't think is helpful. Um, but what was I going to say? Um, yeah. So, like, what do you do? And we don't know, right? And this was oh yeah, it was a pandemic I was coming from. To me, pandemic was a really radicalizing period for me.
Mm.
There was a lot of mental models I had about a lot of different institutions and people and even countries that like just got fucking blown to smithereens.
Yeah, I'm in Melbourne. I'm in Victoria,
Oh
Australia,
shit!
where we were like the
You really
most
got
locked
the
down.
full
I did
brunt.
not see that coming. I until 2020, I thought Australia was America light, and then I just watched how we just all locked down, and it was all like vaccine mandates and stuff like that. I was like, okay, fair enough. Seems like we have some different values than what I thought we did. Not
It's like the
not
go thing,
making a value judgment. I was just surprised that there
right?
was so much uniformity about it.
It's like the go thing. You're like, oh, I like go, I'm like whatever, and then you show up. Oh shit, these people. I thought we were. Oh no, oh we're not. Oh
Yeah.
oh. To me, I have some friends from Australia, and I got some of the anecdotes from there, including some of the quarantine stories where I just went like, I'm believing this because you're my friend, and I know you're not lying to me because you're my friend. If a stranger had told me that, I would have gone like, that sounds crazy.
Mm.
I don't even scarcely believe those stories. Um, so that was pretty wild. The one that really noodled me though was the Canadian trucker protest.
Hmm.
Um, and because I had the same mental model of Canada. Oh, Canada is like just a kinder, nicer America where they're more polite and they're constantly apologizing for everything. And you're like, holy shit, no. There's also a deeply authoritarian streak here that I did not have in my mental model. And I
Mm.
think if you're looking at what's going on in the UK right now, with their going on, so let's just put it like that, the like you will get arrested and prosecuted for retweeting the wrong tweet thing that's going on. You're like, oh shit, I also did not know that. Like, how did that? I mean, COVID gave some previews, some hints, but what's happening right now to me is just like I so I see a tweet on Twitter and I go like, someone's fucking exaggerating. Let me look that up through a source and like, holy shit, here's the official video of the police person like literally just saying that we're gonna
Mm.
come after you, and I don't care if you're in the United States, you retweet the what? What the what? And again, actually, I don't want to say it. What I was about to say was almost like the go thing. Hey, if that's how you want to live, all good. I no, that's one of the things where I actually do think there are universal truths, and
Mm.
there are more right and more wrong answers. And I think on that particular point, America actually has more of the right answers when it comes to things like the First Amendment. Um, Enshrining freedom of speech to that degree, that deep into the operating system, that's really difficult to extract and pull out or even curtail. Holy shit, that has been an illustration of why that was such a smart idea.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you look at the UK or Canada. I don't know as much about the Australian situation, where you see like that was not baked into the foundation, and that means it lives on a much higher level in the stack. It's in userland,
Yeah.
and like fuck could just be deleted. Like someone could just go like, all right, we don't need that app anymore. Free speech. What do you mean? Like, what was the quote? Something about yeah. I mean, this is the hypocrisy that I find so fascinating. On one hand, people who don't believe in free speech at all feel a necessity to like still feign that they do. Like almost all authoritarian regimes, even if you asked them in China, they'd probably be like, yeah, free speech. I mean, except for criticizing the party,
Yeah.
except for what was they saying? What's the term in the EU now? Misinformation. I mean, free speech, yeah. I mean, except for saying things that like whoever's in power right now
Untrue.
wants to be true.
Yeah.
Wait, what? I think that's basically the definition of not free speech, right? No one needs free speech to say the pie is delicious, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's not what we're trying to protect here. We're trying to protect controversial statements, opposition, critique, all the things, right? And I mean, that's also one of those things where like the human instincts are as old as time. Like no fucking tyrant in the history of the world has ever liked critique, right? How many fucking kings and barons have cut the head off the jesters who were a little too funny at
Mm-hmm.
their expense, right? You're like, off with their heads. So we don't cut people's heads off, most of the time in the West at least. But we still don't like it. And if we can find a way to finagle the system to essentially prosecute these things and make them shut up. That's the main thing, right? Make them shut up. Don't say that. That's in misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. It constantly seems to mutate into a new version here. Then you end up with sort of this pursuit, and you go like, this is actually one of the things that are simple but hard.
Mm.
I love those kind of things. So much of again, what I like about Stoicism and why I keep rereading the manual by Epictetus, for example, it's not because I'm learning new things. It's because the things I learned are very difficult to put into effect on a
Mm.
regular basis. And I need constant reminders to be able to enact the things I want to enact and act the way I want to act, right? And it's the same thing with these fundamental principles, right? Like freedom of speech is a very porous and easily sort of dilutable concept that you don't have to add too many caveats to it before suddenly it doesn't mean anything at all. And I think again, and I didn't used to do this. I would give America tremendous credit. Like it's actually quite specific in the U.S. case law and whatever what constitutes free speech and what doesn't. Right? You're like, all right, you can't be in a mob right now saying attack that person and chop their head off. Right?
Mm.
You're going to be held culpable for that. Um, you're not going to be held comfortable for general things like saying like I don't like this person or that person. Like again, now we're really getting specific, and then usually things get spicier. Usually, it's much easier to just talk at the abstract level than it is at the concrete. But like things like hate speech, right? Like what does that actually cover? That means different
Mm-hmm.
things from different people, and let's not even get into the definition of that. In part because it's so fuzzy, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not a thing that's illegal. Like First Amendment literally um, that's not it's not legal. Neither is misinformation, right? Here, I'm going to say a lot of things that aren't true. Now, we have things like defamation laws and those kind of libel and those things. Okay, so there's some potential consequences here for some of these things, and this is why all of it does get murky to some extent at the end. But that doesn't mean there aren't sort of lines and where you can go like, okay, I don't know exactly where it is, but I know this part is over it. I know whatever the fuck is going on in the UK, whatever the hell was going on in Canada with freezing the bank accounts of people who donated to the wrong political campaign. That is fucking bonkers nonsense. I no. Um, and my mental models needed a serious revamp after going through that where COVID was really there's just so many things at the same time coming at it, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you live through what is it stalling that like decades can go by and nothing happens and minutes can go by and decades happen. Now I'm really butchering the quote, but like COVID felt like that to me, right? Like you literally had what seemed like decades worth of political I was about to call it innovation, which is a better word, perhaps, but like
Reversion,
after a
perhaps.
very short period of time,
Yeah.
where like literally decades could have passed into preceding time, where like, and not much happened. So,
Hmm.
um, but I mean, let me also just add to the end here is like it's totally fair for different people to have different analyses here, and this is one of the things I really disliked about the period that existed from, let's say, late 2010s to maybe even as late as a year and a half ago. I kind of feel like we are on the other side. That like that debate, the legitimacy of debate about philosophical and moral questions, essentially got shut down.
Hmm.
As certainly within technology and so forth. Like we really, there was a very successful virus that just went through. Like you can't even speak these things. We can't have a debate about them. If you say any of these things, you're one of the isms. You have committed an ism, and oh man, phew, what a dark ages to, and it's
Yeah.
so fascinating, right? Like the real dark ages, how long did that fucking last? Like 400 years or something. And here we got like a dark ages that felt like we got like the speed run version.
Hmm.
What if you did dark ages, but we're just gonna do like 5 years, and we're just gonna do it on these moral topics? Go. And I was like, holy shit. I thought for a while like we're gonna be in this for fucking 10 years, 20 years, maybe. Jesus Christ. And then suddenly the skies parted and the sun shine through to some extent. Like not that anything is ever settled,
Mm.
but like suddenly, like the whole atmosphere is just very, very different. I mean, for example, just the conversation we're having now, which I feel is at a relatively high level, maybe like little sprinklings of spice in it, unthinkable that you could have published this in 2020 and
Mm.
not being
Well,
actually.
we'll find out once I publish this interview whether everyone stops using Lazygit in droves.
I mean, there's still pockets of that. I'd be surprised if you don't hear anything, but I can tell you, as someone who went through several rounds of transgressive thought
Mm.
and expression from especially 2021 forward, holy shit, the intensity of that era was just off the scales in a way I literally hope never to experience again in my lifetime.
Yeah.
Um, and I think, at least in terms of personal experience, the last thing I think, what I would compare to like late 60s, like Vietnam protest war things, like that level of just absolutely at each other's throat, constantly shit going on in like daily life interaction, like you can't escape it kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, Hopefully, this is, I mean, if I go through it again, it'll be another, what is it going to be? 60 years. I'm not going to be here. Great. Let's do it on a 60-year cycle.
I was thinking because you mentioned technology. Like, I've always wondered, like, why has technology as a profession? Why did it get so? Why was it so involved in that whole thing? And I was thinking about how, like, if you're deploying code that gets used by like millions of people, maybe you're just thinking more about the ethical consequences of that. And I think about a lot of the zeitgeist in many of these strains of thought is about like small things that can have large effects, like using certain words and things like that. And it's funny because I've got a history of having like OCD, especially as a kid, where I'd imagine that some small thing that I did would have some catastrophic consequences. So I spent all these years trying to think the exact opposite way, where it's like that's probably not going to happen, and if you catastrophize things, it's just a very bad way to live. But a lot of these things that were coming out of technology were very much in that same vein, catastrophizing that if you use a certain word,
Yes.
that there'll be
Yes.
these big consequences. And so it was interesting viewing that from the sidelines and thinking about how like I've got this mental scaffolding that took me a while to build up just based on my own psyche and whatever, that seemed to be different to what the mainstream perspective was at the time.
Yeah, I mean that's what's so interesting is that um, a lot of the sort of psychological labeling of these kinds of pathologies were all like exposure therapy. Let's take that one. CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. Like you're afraid of spiders. How is the way we make you less afraid of spiders? Well, first we put you in a room with a spider, but the spider's in a box, right? Then you walk up to the box. Then you put your hand on the glass. Like this with CBT happens over some period of time, right?
Hmm.
Then you touch a small spider that's very innocuous and you realize, oh, the catastrophe that I imagined does not come to pass, right? And you build up exposure to it. So the way you you train your resilience is to get exposed to something and realize that like the terrible thing you thought didn't happen.
Mm.
A lot of what happened in this awful period was the opposite. Like it was literally, there's some great articles on this on reverse CBT,
Mm.
that microaggressions was how do we train your mind to pick up these, maybe a glance, maybe a word or an intonation that you can somehow internalize as being something negative to you or a slight or whatever, and you go like, this is so fascinating. We have a whole discipline, perhaps the most successful branch of sort of applied psychology, CBT, like the one that literally replicates,
Mm-hmm.
where the studies show that this intervention, line of intervention, is actually effective, right? Like we can cure or seriously mitigate people's fear of heights or arachnophobia or whatever. That's a major accomplishment. What if we flipped it around and introduced those things into people? Like it's actually so devious as to be almost impressive. Like how do, and I mean it actually is impressive, and this is where if we go back to these 60s and the long march through the institutions and so forth, Herbert Marcuse, and if you read some of this stuff, like how do you radicalize the proletariat towards revolution? Because the problem in the 60s was, holy shit, the West is actually doing too well,
Mm-hmm.
rising standards of living, we're never going to get these fuckers at the assembly line with their pensions and their houses and their cars in the garage to rebel. We're never going to get them to bring the glorious revolution because they simply have it too good. So the way to do that in Herbert Marcuse and the rest of sort of that gang's optics was, well, first we have to erase or attack their false consciousness. You think you have it good, but actually, here's a bunch of microaggressions to be on the lookout for. Here's a way for you to actually end up feeling terrible about everything all the time. And now, when you do that, when you are beaten and everything seems so bad and so dystopian and whatever, you're ready for the revolution. Um, so there's a whole thing to unpack there, and as I unpacked it in the aftermath of all this, just trying to understand, like, oh, this is just fascinating. First of all, I've been through the grinder here. Like, I'd like to understand how this machine works. Like, who designed the machine, who came up with the diagrams and so forth of it, and that trail led all the way back to the 60s and Marcuse and
Mm.
the Frankfurt School and all that stuff. But you just look at some of this stuff and you just go like, yeah, we've been doing the opposite of what like you should be doing to create strong, resilient people who are optimistic and will work for a better future and so forth. Instead, we've created a large group of hyper fragile, hypersensitive, um, bitter, vicious individuals who are not very successful at producing better outcomes,
Mm.
and very adept at making things a whole shit of a lot worse. Um, and I think again, just a fascinating time to live through. I think when sort of, obviously you can only understand history backwards. When we get a little distance to this, we will look back upon this as just absolutely incomprehensible insanity.
Mm-hmm.
In much the same way, and now there's a Gervin law accusation here, but in much the same way that people before the what is the Milgram experiment went like incomprehensible, that like how could World War II happen? Like how could such unspeakable evil and whatever, and then a bunch of Americans in lab coats in some fucking suburb somewhere made a bunch of volunteers shock um, innocent individuals because they were being told to do so. There's a bunch of sort of deep understanding of human nature and whatever that things feel or seem very incomprehensible once you get a little bit of distance to it. But
Mm-hmm.
like we're so close to what just transpired in technology and elsewhere, and still is. I mean, by the way, this isn't all fucking over. It just has
Yeah,
receded
totally.
in technology. Um, that I don't think we fully appreciate that in like 10 years from now, people look back on it with some incredulity. That's at
Mm-hmm.
least my hope.
Yeah, I think like if for me personally, I'm still always going to be open when someone says, "Hey, there's this thing you're doing that has these bad
Right.
consequences." Like
Right.
you always have to hear them out and see what the
Yes.
argument is. But it can be very difficult if it's like I'm coming to this with my perspective and maybe the supposed victim has a completely different perspective and I just aren't that person, so I can't really know what's going through their head. It's just a tricky thing. I think the reason this has been such a big deal is just because it is so tricky and because so often the the fact that the victim is just a different person to you, ostensibly by class or race or gender or something like that.
Yeah,
And then it's like, okay, well, what right do I have to impose my viewpoint, right, as limited as it is, onto the situation? It's
right.
just really hairy, and
But
I
so what
still,
to me is
yeah,
what's so interesting to that is it is really hairy in the West. There's a lot of other places where it's not hairy at all.
hmm,
You go to fucking China, like, they're not having these moral qualms, at least in the broad public. Like it's not dictating the direction of it. There's a different ideology in charge, and it's not suffering this kind of shit, right?
hmm,
And that is to the point that many of the Western world's best ideas are being weaponized against itself, right? Like our sort of like, all right, well, let's hear it out. Like our openness trait of like we're open to new information, we're open to
yeah,
new ideas. Um, our sort of background in Christianity. This goes all the way to Nietzsche and his Christianity's slave morality and
hmm,
all this stuff of like we take the side of the oppressed
hmm,
as a default. That's like a cultural value. That's all the way to Jesus.
hmm.
Um, and that stuff can get weaponized. Like it can be positive things that have really helped the West move forward can be turned into an exploit, right? There's this open door, and if you program your mind wires in a certain way, it's going to fit into these receptors, and it's going to turn into a cancer that destroys them.
But do
And I
you
think that
feel that there are people deliberately pulling the strings, or do you think it's like well-meaning, well-intentioned people who are just on the wrong track?
I think there is absolutely a core. Not just was is a core group of ideologists who absolutely know what they're doing. I
Hmm.
mean, this is where Herbert Marcuse, who I referenced earlier, like, they wrote it down. Like, here's the roadmap. Here's how we're going to use Western values to sort of attack itself. Here's how to subvert these kind of things.
Hmm.
Now, is that the broad masses? 100 fucking most people who show up in a march or is even part of some of these online mobs or whatever, they don't have a clue who Herbert Marcuse is, or if they do, it's because they've seen this 4 screen comic about the paradox of intolerance or the paradox of tolerance, I think it's called,
Hmm.
and they go like, "Yeah, this is who they don't fucking know. I didn't fucking know. Most people haven't traced the lineage of all of this nonsense all the way back to its source. Even fewer are sort of scholars and really understanding it. So no, I don't. I think the vast majority are simply having their exploits triggered, right? Like having their basic human sympathies and whatever weaponized in a way that end up being their negation, right? Like that's the if we get even more specific, like DEI was such a insidious program in the sense that we go like, okay, we in the US, for example, there was the civil rights movement and there was the content of your character and all of this. Like, let's
Colorblindness.
exactly, let's get above that. Let's treat people as individuals and they're judged in their own merits and their own content of character and whatever. And then that gets distorted into now we actually need segregated racial and other identity marker subgroups and they have to be separated from each other and all this stuff where you go like that. It's literally the opposite. Like it's espousing sort of an adherence to some ideals that you can perhaps like recognize. Okay, I can sort of see where that comes from, but
Mm.
like the final consequences end up being sort of the opposite. And are most people who advocate for that are they sort of in on that long march through the institution? No, of course they're not. Right?
Mm.
They're thinking like, hey, I'm on the right side of history here. Like this is what we need to do to make amends. This is all the governing explanation for all of this is like this must be discrimination. Like this, there's got to be a cabal here of whatever rich white dudes, as the stereotype goes, who controls everything, and the patriarchy, and all of these theories as to why outcomes are the way they are, and like that's what the truth is, right? Um, yeah. Anyway, I think we could talk about this for hours, and I actually think, I mean, I do like to talk about that some because the way I got uh, more intimately familiar with these topics was by some individuals talking about this more.
Mm.
Glenn Laurie and
Coleman Hughes.
Warder.
Have you heard of
They
Coleman
wrote
Hughes?
the what?
Coleman Hughes.
I followed him a little bit, but not nearly as much as Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter.
Uh-huh.
They have a wonderful podcast, which in the aftermath of some of my exposure to this stuff was one of the first things that someone pointed me towards. That was really an eye opener
Mm.
to have these two eminent black scholars go through some of it and say things at a time where it felt like their racial identity allowed them to say things and not get blown into space
Yeah.
at the really height of some of this stuff. Was really influential, and um, I can highly recommend that. The other one I'd recommend, and this is again coming from someone who, like, I've considered myself a liberal my whole life, right? Like, if you do Big Five analysis on my personality type, I'm going to match up quite liberal.
Hmm.
Um, which meant that to some extent, I was actually literally ignorant about the other side of the argument. That conservatism, for example, was a parody, or it was inhibited by these cartoon characters um, that didn't have any intellectual depth.
Hmm.
And then once I started reading conservative thinkers with intellectual depth, like Thomas Sowell was one
Hmm.
of my favorites.
Yep.
What is it? Cosmic Justice, and he has, like, there's a trifecta of books that are really influential on me. And listening to Glenn Lowry, even McWhorter. I mean, I wouldn't classify McWhorter as a conservative. Lowry, yes, but
Hmm.
not McWhorter. Just, oh shit, here's some articulated arguments. Whether I buy them or I don't buy them, getting that exposure to the most articulate form of the argument on the other side, and as most of these things are, and this is one of Thomas Sowell's main things that really hammered it home for me. Like, they are trade-offs, right? Like, there's not a solution to,
Mm.
say, poverty.
Yep.
Like, just take that for. There's different ways of configuring those trade-offs, and they can be more effective or less effective. But there are trade-offs in how you treat that. And I came up from it, and Thomas Sowell really helped me recognize this. I came from things, and still do. That's still my natural temperament. No, we can solve it. We can solve poverty, for example. Why can't we solve poverty? Just like I was thinking, we can solve web application development.
Hmm.
Um, and that is one of those main fault lines between conservatism and liberalism, at least as Thomas Sowell diagnoses it. That conservatives believes in trade-offs and liberals believes in solutions.
Mm.
And I think you need some of both. Like, I still like some of the ideals, even if I'm wised up on, like, their infeasibility, but, like, of solutions. I want to work towards some solutions. But Saul has made a very persuasive argument that, like, do you know what? Okay, fine. Just don't believe you're going to get there.
Mm.
Believe that these are trade-offs. And hey, we could get to zero. There's 42,000 people died on U.S. roads last year. That's the number of traffic accidents, right? We could literally cut that to zero tomorrow. We ban all automobiles and all sorts of propulsion that travels more than 10 miles an hour. Boom. 42,000 lives saved. Okay, what's the trade-off? What is
Everyone's lives suck so much more.
exactly? What does human society look like after that?
Mm.
And then you'd get the polemics. I mean, I just set this up as a contrast. I mean, I can just hear it right now. Well, but public transportation, and there's a whole debate there we can have there too, right? But there's a way to solve 42,000 people's death tomorrow. We're not going to take it because the trade-offs are insane.
Mm.
And there are a lot of far more nuanced trade-offs than that, right? Like, that's such an extreme, and most people go like, yeah, well, okay, if that's ridiculous. There are trade-offs that are tighter and harder and become more moral dilemmas where different people can actually end up with different conclusions,
Mm.
and we're not going to know necessarily the answer right away. This is one of the things, for example, I felt about legalizing pot. I remember growing up in Denmark, and, like, I had a bunch of friends who smoked pot, and I was always like, "What the fuck is this illegal? Is this really worse than alcohol?" I was like, "Legalize it, right?" And then now we've run the experiment in a bunch of places, and you're like, "Oh shit, I'm not
Like,
sure
didn't
about
know
the
that
experiment."
Seattle would smell like a mix of urine and weed everywhere you walk. But there you go.
That is one of the things I really had not considered. I really had not considered what the oral character of a city. The same thing with New York, where the oral character of a city, like, can change, and you
Mm.
can go like, "Oh shit, I really don't like this." Like, maybe alcohol is bad for the individual, and there's also other side effects and whatever. But, like, it doesn't stink in the public space in the way it does. Now, again, there's a million arguments one way or another. This is just one cherry picked illustration of something I used to consider to be obvious.
Hmm.
The other thing I also didn't consider to be obvious was like the pot that my friend smoked in the mid 90s was of a certain potency that bears no correlation to the shit that you buy today. Right? THC levels and whatever have just like these things have just gotten optimized in part through the expansion of a bigger market, the professionalization enabled by legalization and so forth, to a point where like, oh shit, this is not the same thing anymore.
Hmm.
These are far more potent things, and maybe that's not like just universally good,
Hmm.
right? So I'm not even rendering a verdict on that. I don't know. Still, is the right answer this thing or the other thing? What I do know was I had a certain certainty that I certainly don't have anymore.
Yeah.
That reality was able to disabuse me of like this being such an obvious choice. And I remember thinking, this is again mid 2015s or something like that. The US has just started with legalization. I forget when that happened exactly. And I was like, oh man, my native Denmark, they're so behind the times. Why can't we legalize it in Denmark? And like all the things right now I go like, oh shit, I'm kind of glad they didn't. Like let's give this experiment a little longer in the US to see whether we're so sure that it should follow. And then you could take that even further. I actually used to believe um, quite strongly that you should just legalize all drugs.
Hmm.
But like consent theory, I was definitely very much taken by that. If someone chooses that they want to smoke fucking crack or heroin or fentanyl, that isn't that their choice? And it turns out, okay, we ran a long run experiment on that, especially in San Francisco and on the West Coast for well over a decade. And you go like, oh shit, no, it's not just a personal choice. There
Hmm.
are absolutely all sorts of catastrophic societal factors. And even on the personal level, it's just a human tragedy of almost incomprehensible proportions.
Yeah.
But it's
Addiction, it changes
120,000,
everything.
120,000. We just talked about 42,000 car deaths a year, right?
Hmm.
2 to 3 times as many Americans die from overdoses. I mean, that is just a tremendous, catastrophic human catastrophe of just incomparable proportions.
Hmm.
And we go like, holy shit. So if that all came from the fact that Oxycontin was essentially legalized in the 90s, and not just legalized, but halfway pushed. And then we ended up with a bunch of people addicted to opioids. And then da 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 da. Now we're here. Shit. Maybe humanity can't take all temptations. Maybe
Yeah.
we aren't that strong. And again, this is one of the things. Now we're really coming full circle. Religion knew this. Religion had all sorts of prohibitions. They built in mechanisms like shame and algorithms for enforcing social norms and so forth to make sure that like the base human instincts didn't just get free reign,
Hmm.
right? And we threw all that away, or a lot of that away, and we replaced it with you do your thing, man. Whatever you want. Consent is the golden calf that we will worship or worship above all else. And as long as there's consent, it's all good. Narrator, it wasn't all good, right? So, yeah, these are really fascinating, deep, difficult moral and societal questions. And a lot of these we don't have at all the answers, but we do have some evidence coming back from some of the experiments.
Hmm.
And I do think it would be prudent to adjust some of our hypotheses about incentives and what happens and how things turn out on the basis of actual experiments run in the wild, especially the very grand ones we've run a lot of West Coast cities in particular on, say, drug legalization or harm reduction theories or
Hmm.
whatever that kind of didn't pan out the way they did. Even if I personally, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have gone, that sounds nice.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, all right, drug addicts, let's give them clean needles and whatever. It's just that, like, maybe then they'll come to their senses and, like, oh, okay, no, that didn't make a dent.
Yeah. I listened to a podcast called Econ Talk, which is very much on the pro-capitalist side of economics podcasts, and it does disappoint me that they rarely talk about addiction. I just feel it's so important. Like it's not as simple as like, oh, I'm going to use my free will to go and buy something because it brings me value, and it's like,
Right.
if like maybe cocaine is valuable or whatever it is, but it's just like, would you want to do that if you weren't addicted to it? Um, and
It's it's
yeah,
it's difficult because even that one, I've known a lot of people who've taken a fair amount of cocaine. A lot of
And
people,
some of them
a
have
lot of those
made
had a very good
successful
time
companies and
and did not become addicted. They did not become addict,
mm,
right? Um, Now, what does that mean? Like, there are some substances. There's lots of people who took OxyContin to get over healing, whatever. They did not become addicts. Um, but there is also, okay, on a grand scale, when you run the experiment at large, run, right? Like, what happens? And clearly, sometimes our intuitions are just, they're not correct,
mm,
right? Like, we think one thing and another thing happened, and we should adjust our sails when, like, the wind changes. I mean, and when, as evidence comes in, you should update your mental models,
mm,
right? This is, what is it, the famous quote about, like, some politicians being accused of flip-flopping on an issue, and he goes like, well, I update my opinions when new information arrives. What do you do, sir? So I try to stay in that mode. I really do. um, that, like, I try to develop mental models to have an understanding of what the world is and how it functions. I I will say now, and this is a function of age, at 45, I have a higher degree of humility associated with those mental models and their ability to be
mm.
long term correct. And I have more of a keen interest of updating those models when reality proves them wrong.
For sure. Yeah. I always try to like watch debates on YouTube between, on any political or social topic, something like that, where it's like I'll have friends saying this is the obvious truth, and they'll go, okay, I'll go watch a debate on it, and I was like, oh man, it's like it's not that clear cut. Um, and it's the same with like looking at evidence in terms of actual experiments to get run in the wild. Like you learn so much more from that than just from being in a bubble and just absorbing the
Yeah.
zeitgeist from that.
Yep. Yep. And I think it's not easy to do. And I think one of the things I've been on the lookout for, as I've been updating these mental models, I think the other instinct we have is we want to be tribal, right? We want to associate with larger group of people. We want to feel protected. We want to feel part of a community, whatever. It's not, it's quite easy in your process of updating mental models just to, like, flip it, right? Like, okay, I used to believe this thing, and now traumatic insight happened. Red pill, blue pill, white pill. Wow, there's a lot of different
There's a
colors.
black pill now. I don't know what it means.
I haven't even, I can't keep track of all the pills. You take one of the pills, and all of a sudden, like, your worldview is changed, and, like, now you're on team whatever, 74. You were on 24 before, and now you're on 74. To which degree can we kind of try to push back against that and still live in a connected world where we have people who believe roughly the same things and so forth? And I'm trying to expand my personal tolerance for that kind of dissent. And it's one of the characters that's helped me with that. Not that he knows about it, is Elon Musk. I used to be very, very critical and negative about almost everything that Elon did, and I still am quite critical about a huge inventory of things that man is up to. And but I'm also recognizing, all right, I can have a laundry list of shit I think that Elon is a moron for doing. And then I can also look at the laundry list of just undeniable contributions to humanity that individual has pushed through more or less single-handedly,
Mm.
and go, like, when I weigh these things, right? Oh, dude's an asshole on Twitter, posts saucy memes in a way that's not befitting someone of his stature, whatever. That has some pull on this. And then there's the other thing. Oh, I mean, single-handedly changed the automotive industry in terms of electrification. Sending rockets towards Mars might save the stranded astronauts and the space station. Like, oh, okay, actually, now at least I go, like, all right, this weighs heavier for me, even if I still recognize all the same stuff. But what's even more important than which way the scale goes is that there is a scale, and there's stuff over here, and there's stuff over there, and sometimes the scale goes a little like this, and sometimes the scale goes a little like that. It goes up and down, and that is the human experience. We're full of contradictions, and we're
Mm.
full of dualities, and we're full of truths and falsehoods. And that's not a carte blanche. That, again, it's not full relativism. It's not postmodernism. It's not that everyone has their own truth and there's nothing we can be sure of. Whatever. It's just that life for me is more interesting when I have a broader tolerance of trying to understand different humans and where they're coming from, whether I agree with them or not. Um, like, what constitutes beyond the pale needs to be truly beyond the pale, and I feel like that's the spectrum that have been shrinking for a lot of folks in really bad ways. And I think this is one. There's a great video on YouTube by this guy William B. Buckley, I think is his name, and he had this show called The Firing Line.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great episode from the 60s where he's this conservative thinker, right? And he he invites this Black Panther onto his show, right? Like Black Panther with all the ideology of the Black Panthers in the late 60s, full on armed revolution and all the things, right? And William Buckley and this guy from the Black Panthers just sit there and relatively calmly have a discussion about ideology, oppression, the US, whatever. And I just go like, that's freaking amazing. Like that breadth of spectrum of being literally curiously interested in what like quote unquote the other side has to say about topics and really understand their point of view.
Mm.
Oh my God, it feels like it's from a lost civilization, right? Like you go on Twitter and it's basically nothing but people just screaming slogans at each other from
Mm-hmm.
in all directions. And then you look at the firing line and go like, holy shit, society could be constructed like this? We could like that was primetime television. Primetime fucking television. Did you had two people just sit like and discuss ideas relatively calmly without screaming at each other?
Mm.
Holy shit. Amazing.
Inspirational. Well, David, I've taken up probably more than enough of your time. It's been a blast. Thanks for coming on the podcast, and I'll be keeping up with your latest updates on your Linux journey.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation and the very deep philosophical, societal, sociological exploration we went on. I think that is it's a lot of fun to talk about these things, and I'm really happy that the overtone window has reopened to a degree that like conversations like these are possible,
Mm.
and that hopefully people, whether they agree or they disagree or even strongly or whatever, are able to just go like, oh, all right, I'll enjoy a conversation and I don't have to agree with all of it. And maybe I get a little inspired about some things and I don't like other things. And also then life goes on afterwards. People set words to each other in exploration of ideas. And like that doesn't have to melt down my inner world here. Like I'm able to comprehend that different people can look at it differently. And we live.
David, it's been a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right, that was a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me just quickly plug my startup, Subble. You might have heard me mention it during that interview. Subble is a product which helps you manage your SaaS subscriptions within your company. So if you have like the typical tech company just has a bunch of subscriptions to like Slack and GitHub and Jira and Confluence, and every employee has access, but half of them aren't really using the licenses, and so you're kind of just wasting money on licenses that aren't being used. Or maybe an employee leaves, but nobody has removed them from some product, meaning that they still have, say, access to GitHub or something like that. All those problems are what Subble tries to solve. So if you're interested in that, I'll add a link in the description, or just go to www.subble.com. That's Subble spelled Subble. So it rhymes with bubble. But with that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.